able to close the gap on Dragon Quest in a meaningful way. Final Fantasy was no longer playing catch-up, they were now a legitimate rival and contemporary. There was no time to rest on their laurels, however. Sakaguchi knew that if Square were to continue to maintain and then grow their market share, they needed to ensure a quick turnaround time on their next project. But beyond that, he also knew that whatever they brought to market needed to be even bigger and better than anything they had produced before. There were just a few challenges. First, there was a sense that the two major objectives may contradict each other, as rushing to get the next installment out may lead to a diminishment in quality. Second, due to the continued success of Final Fantasy, Sakaguchi's role within the company was required to change. But failure was not an option. Final Fantasy had to succeed, no matter what. This mantra emboldened the existing staff to go again, with any new staff who joined the team quickly coming to realise the standards that were expected if they were going to survive in this environment. Everything was fast-paced and frenetic, but when all these aspects combined, they led to the creation of Final Fantasy VI, an experience that ended up being life-changing for those involved in its creation and those who played it.
Ever since my dermatologist recommended Eucerin Radiant Tone, I'm kind of obsessed with the results. I just keep getting better.
Paris. Exclusive events at incredible restaurants.
By the end of 1992, Final Fantasy V sat as the fourth best-selling game released so far on the Super Famicom. It was only behind Super Mario World, Dragon Quest V, and Super Mario Kart, and had managed to supplant another stalwart in Street Fighter II. Such performance showed the power of the Final Fantasy brand, but it also highlighted the extreme competition they faced. Super Mario World and Super Mario Kart were first-party titles that had no close contemporaries on the platform. Indeed, Sonic the Hedgehog had emerged as Mario's main competitor, but that particular rivalry was born from hardware manufacturers themselves wanting to duke it out, and in Japan at least, it wasn't even really a rivalry at all. Street Fighter II was in a similar situation, serving as a trailblazer for the burgeoning fighting scene on consoles. Fatal Fury launched soon after, but its impact was minimal by comparison, only selling 50,000 copies in its first week on sale. It meant the Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy franchises existed in a unique situation, as they both resided in the exact same genre, and they were both capable of selling millions of copies. This meant there was a very realistic possibility that one brand was able to steal market share from the other, and from the outside, it looked as though this was already starting to happen. Dragon Quest had been the undoubted king of role-playing games during the Famicom era. Even though other franchises were popular on personal computers, such as Ultima and Wizardry, the brilliance of Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura helped to define the genre to a new audience, and other creators such as Hironobu Sakaguchi, Koji Okada, Kotaro Hayashida, Masayoshi Hashimoto, and Keisuke Terasaki were all playing catch-up and attempting to forge their own path. Out of this collection, however, Final Fantasy was the only entry to see the same kind of growth as Dragon Quest. and the decision by Yuji Horii to spend so long developing Dragon Quest V had only strengthened the position of Final Fantasy. Whereas the first 3 Dragon Quest games came out at a rapid pace, with 3 games releasing in less than 2 years that collectively sold 7.7 million copies, Dragon Quest IV had taken longer to develop than those 3 games combined, and its sales, when it did launch, were lower than Dragon Quest III. Dragon Quest V then took even longer to develop, and by the middle of 1993, its sales had only just passed those of Dragon Quest II. Despite there still being huge intrigue around the franchise, it became clear to Horii that something wasn't working, and that something was the speed at which they worked in comparison to the team at Square. Horii even noted in an interview alongside Sakaguchi that he couldn't believe how Square managed to pump out Final Fantasy games so quickly without there being any kind of drop in quality. Speed, however, was a huge advantage, and Sakaguchi knew this. They needed to ensure they kept the focus and attention of consumers on their franchise, not their competitors, and he created the internal goal of ensuring a brand new Final Fantasy game released every single year, no matter the cost. It seemed far-fetched given how complicated development was becoming, but Sakaguchi believed they could achieve this goal with the right balance, and the results were there, clear as day. Final Fantasy III launched right after Dragon Quest IV, and Final Fantasy V launched right after Dragon Quest V. Square had therefore managed to release an entire entry that Dragon Quest had no answer for, despite also cancelling another iteration entirely, and by mid-1993, the collective sales of Final Fantasy IV and V had surpassed what Enix had achieved with their first iteration on the Super Famicom. Not only that, but whereas Dragon Quest V saw its sales shrink in comparison to its predecessor, Final Fantasy V saw its sales grow. This created a very tense atmosphere between the two companies, but Kazuhiko Torishima, the influential media mogul who had lectured Sakaguchi after the release of Final Fantasy III and had a pre-existing close relationship with Horii, served as something of a mediator. He encouraged Sakaguchi and Horii to meet, and they developed a cordial relationship, but neither Sakaguchi or Horii was ever willing to talk too much about what they had in the pipeline, lest it give the other a competitive advantage. Indeed, the pair confessed to religiously playing each other's new releases to see what innovations were present, as neither wanted to be accused of plagiarism or being a cheap imitation. And if there was something that they felt was too derivative, the two tour de forces would then go back to their teams and demand that they modify that particular aspect, whether it be related to a specific character, a plot device, or even a gameplay system, as they wanted to ensure there could be no accusations, but also because they wanted their game to be superior.
For customers like Jack, great experiences aren't built with your best guess. They're built with data you can trust to be accurate.
The external rivalry between Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy created some healthy competition, helping to push the genre to new heights. But Square was also keen to create internal competition too, as they sought to turn their company from its humble beginnings as a small publisher of games on personal computers into a publishing juggernaut that could rival some of the biggest players that were based in Japan. Pre-Final Fantasy, Square had created 4 separate development divisions that worked on independent projects, but after the success of Final Fantasy, most of those divisions were dissolved, and primary focus was placed around ensuring Final Fantasy II surpassed its predecessor. After this objective was accomplished, Square started to branch out again, with Saga finding its footing and Mana following soon after. The success of Romancing Saga then cemented that this was the correct approach, but as the company grew, so too did their approach to development. For the longest time, even when teams were separate, there was a strong notion of shared learning and resource management. It wasn't uncommon for individuals to contribute to multiple games at the same time, irrespective of which team was overseeing development. If certain individuals had skills that were needed to complete a specific task, they were just loaned out for a short period or shifted teams entirely until the project was complete. This approach was even present during the development of Final Fantasy IV, as numerous individuals were expected to work concurrently on the next iteration of Final Fantasy for the Famicom and Super Famicom, while also supporting other projects such as Rad Racer 2. But after the completion of Final Fantasy IV, everything started to change. Sakaguchi appreciated that to ensure a quick turnaround time, the core spine of his team needed to remain intact, so as to avoid everything they'd learnt being lost. This spine could then be supplemented by individuals from other teams who either showed immense talent or just wanted a change. But the core bulk of the new acquisitions came from fresh hires as opposed to internal moves. But Sakaguchi was not the only person who felt this way, and this led to a near complete delineation of development within Square, which was facilitated by the establishment of clear and defined development departments that could work concurrently with one another, but also independently. But there wasn't just one or two teams codified based on existing workflows and projects, there were 6. As the longest standing development team and the shining light of the company, the team working on Final Fantasy, which was helmed by Sakaguchi, was called Development Team 1. Development Team 2 was then helmed by Akitoshi Kawazu, with their focus being the further expansion of the Romancing Saga franchise. Development Team 3 was then overseen by Hiromichi Tanaka, a stalwart of the company, who was joined by Koichi Ishii and Nasir Jebeli. They were tasked with expanding the Mana franchise. Development Team 4 was helmed by Kazuhiko Aoki, who had been a free spirit for many years. Aoki had assisted with Final Fantasy 3 and 4, but had also proven his leadership skills by creating the Hanjaku Hero franchise, and he was tasked with expanding that particular franchise before then being given the responsibility of starting provisional work on Chrono Trigger. Development Team 5 was then created by Takashi Tokita after he finished up work assisting with the creation of that new Hanjaku Hero game. Due to his efforts up until now, which culminated with Tokita being the principal designer and scenario writer on Final Fantasy IV, he was then given license to create a brand new IP which became Live Alive. The 6th and final development team was then helmed by Chihiro Fujioka, who had overseen Saga 3 and Mystic Quest. As perhaps a way of saying thank you for everything they'd done on those 2 games with almost no support from the rest of the company, Fujioka was given permission to create a brand new strategy RPG. But after struggling to make progress, the team ended up being dissolved to help with the production of Live Alive. Needless to say, there was suddenly a lot going on at Square. No longer were they working on 1 or 2 games per year, they were working on up to 6 that then had to be carefully coordinated by upper management and marketing to ensure there was no oversaturation. And that extra layer was crucial, as each of the development departments started to operate effectively as mini companies, with their own dedicated resources and profit and loss margins. In short, silos started to form. Development Team 1, however, was very much still the main focus, and despite the divisions being created, ensuring Final Fantasy delivered was still of paramount importance to the company. Sakaguchi therefore ensured that those who stayed in the team were the best of the best at Square. But if, for whatever reason, anyone wanted to leave, due to the new structure, they were still able to forge their own paths within other teams. Hiromi Ito, Akihiko Matsui, and Hiroshi Takai, for example, left Development Team 1 to join Development Team 2. And Katsuhisa Higuchi and Masanori Hoshino joined Development Team 4, where they helped Aoki navigate the early stages of development on Chrono Trigger. The other notable mover was Yasunori Mitsuda, who, after becoming frustrated with Uematsu's position as the premium composer at the company, left Development Team 1 due to a lack of available opportunities, something which also ended up rewarding him with the main gig on Chrono Trigger. These elements created something of a perfect storm at Square though, specifically within Development Team 1. They had accrued some of the most talented individuals from across the company, many of whom had now worked on 3 or 4 of the previous 5 Final Fantasy games. But with Dragon Quest V releasing just before Final Fantasy V, and with the sales being more comparable than they ever had been before, the rivalry started to become even more intense, and it started something akin to an arms race to see who could release their next installment first and what innovations they may bring to the table. But even though they should have been set up perfectly, an unfortunate byproduct of Sakaguchi's success threatened to undermine everything they had built so far. Final Fantasy had been fundamental to the success of Square, and although other IPs had been created that helped to bolster their sources of revenue, it was still very much their premium property. Many individuals had contributed to this, and Final Fantasy was very much the sum of its parts. But as the team leader, the role of Sakaguchi could not be understated. He injected creativity when it was required, had expert man management, and also pushed his teams to dream big and hit tough deadlines.
Why do EVs cost less to own over the long run? Well, you never have to buy gas again. And there are fewer parts and fewer repairs. All long-term relationships.
Sakaguchi's position as the head of Development Team 1 was in recognition of these feats, but there also became a sense within the senior management team that Sakaguchi deserved more, and after the release of Final Fantasy IV, he was promoted to the position of Executive Vice President. In the initial sense, this position did not impact his work much, and Sakaguchi was still very hands-on with Final Fantasy V as he had been with every previous game, perhaps even more so with regards to the scenario. But after the release of that game, things started to change. Sakaguchi was tasked with thinking holistically about the future of the Final Fantasy franchise and how it might develop, but he was also tasked with doing the same for many other properties that were being developed around the same time, including Saga, Mana, and the fledgling Chrono Trigger. This placed a clear strain on his connection and commitment to Development Team 1, and it was somewhat at odds with where Final Fantasy needed to be and where they needed to get to. After all, without their fearless leader, how on earth could they hope to raise the bar yet again and continue to close the gap to Dragon Quest? Prior to the release of Final Fantasy V, there was a sense that the team had developed something special. Feedback was good from playtesting, and when they showed it off at trade shows, the game scored well relative to its competition. But the critical and commercial success of the game when it launched, with many of the junior staff thinking that it was unreal to have worked on a game that was so impactful. In the short term, there was a real sense of elation over what had been accomplished. But once the dust had settled and Sakaguchi laid out provisional plans and release windows for the next installment in the franchise, the mood started to shift. This process was nothing new, of course. Many of the other senior figures had worked on numerous iterations of the Final Fantasy franchise. But for those who weren't quite so seasoned, the pressure of attempting to surpass a game of the stature of Final Fantasy V ended up being quite daunting from the outset. And this was because the internal objectives had shifted, as instead of having the objective of Final Fantasy V just surpassing Final Fantasy IV, they were attempting to surpass all other role-playing games. Period. With the reception being so solid, however, there was a sense that even though Dragon Quest V had sold more copies, the objective had still been accomplished. In their mind, and indeed the minds of many others across Japan, Final Fantasy V was a superior role-playing game. This meant that new objectives had to be found. So alongside creating a game that could surpass Final Fantasy V and surpass all other past, present, and hopefully future role-playing games, the team also vowed to make Final Fantasy VI a standout candidate in every area relating to design, gameplay, and presentation. Sakaguchi even told the sound team that they needed to up their game so they could surpass Konami, who were the market leaders in that particular area. They were no longer content with what they had accomplished, and the overriding sentiment going into the development of Final Fantasy VI was that by its conclusion, it needed to be seen as a candidate for being one of the best video games ever made. The fulcrum of this activity was, of course, the team. With Development Team 1 now very much a sustained entity, Sakaguchi was able to employ the same tactics he had for the production of Final Fantasy V. The only major difference was that the spine of the team was now more experienced and larger, and this meant there was more scope to bring in fresh, new blood who were ambitious and eager to prove themselves. The spine consisted of the likes of Yoshinori Kitase and Hiroyuki Ito, who had proven themselves more than capable on Final Fantasy V, but Ken Narita and Kiyoshi Yoshi returned as the game's main programmers. Nobuo Uematsu was there as the main composer, and there were a slew of artists who had impressed and been given promotions as a reward for their fine work and general aptitude. This saw the likes of Tetsuya Takahashi, Tetsuya Nomura, and Hideo Minaba promoted to the role of director alongside Kazuko Shibuya. The new hires, and there were plenty of them, then felt a high degree of prestige having been selected to work on a Final Fantasy game, but they were also aware of the intense pressure they were going to be forced to endure. And this didn't just relate to the pressure to succeed, but also the pressure to keep up with and deliver high work that was befitting a project of this nature, while also being expected to maintain an incredible work ethic throughout the game's entire production run. With this kind of project, there was no room for passengers, and there was an expectation that anyone who was selected to be part of Development Team 1 would be willing to step up to the plate and deliver every single day. The reality was that they had been picked to work on the next iteration in one of the most prestigious Japanese video gaming franchises. And for those who were joining Square, having never worked in the video games industry before, this was a huge deal, especially as many of them were assigned to work on the game's narrative and its visuals, and those were two aspects the player would gain a lot of exposure to, and therefore would have plenty of opinions about. Eiji Nakamura, for example, who was a new hire on Final Fantasy VI, tasked with sampling sound effects and creating tones, later noted that one of the first things Sakaguchi ever said to him after joining the company was, "Don't ever let the quality of your work drop." Alongside the spine and new hires, a few people then moved around from other departments to work on Final Fantasy VI, mostly relating to event planning, sound design and systems engineering. And this was a crucial component, as areas that had never received specific focus before were now given dedicated resources. Sound effects was one such area. In every prior game, they were created by people who just had spare time, often graphic designers who had finished their tasks and had no idea what they were doing. It wasn't until Final Fantasy VI that a dedicated individual was assigned the specific role of creating sound effects. Final Fantasy VI also saw much more focus placed around the story. In the previous game, the majority of the event sequences were made by Kitase and Sakaguchi, but this time a whole team was formed that included 5 people who then supported Kitase and Sakaguchi. All things considered, this meant the staff saw a significant increase in size, with around 40 people involved at some point throughout development, and this was a relatively large team compared to others who were working on games at the time. Outside of establishing the team, however, the biggest question still remained. What kind of game should Final Fantasy VI be? This was a question that was always asked at the beginning of each project, and the initial phase, which began towards the end of January 1993, revolved around people just putting forth their ideas, which was then used to form a general sense of direction that could be followed. There was a major difference this time around, however, compared to what they had previously done. Even though Sakaguchi was still the head of Development Team 1, his active role throughout development was required to change. There were just other challenges in the company that needed his particular skills, and one of them was overseeing the general development pipeline for almost the entire company. Fulfilling that task and managing what was akin to a medium-sized development studio, and also directing the next major iteration in one of the most anticipated games at that time, was just too much. So he made a difficult but very important decision, and that decision was to step down from directorial duties and instead become a producer. In this role, alongside the general ideation, Sakaguchi was able to provide a solid blueprint for what he wanted to see from Final Fantasy VI, before then delegating specific responsibilities out to the 2 individuals he trusted most. In truth, this was similar to the situation that was in place for Final Fantasy V, but it was now more formalized, as Kitase and Ito were promoted to the roles of co-director, and were given more autonomy as to how they accomplished the overriding objectives that were given to them by Sakaguchi, with Kitase effectively overseeing the drama side of development and Ito overseeing the battle. Sakaguchi's job as producer was then to ensure that these 2 aspects that Kitase and Ito were overseeing properly fused together to create a comprehensive and complete package. But with the change of leadership came a slight change of approach. Quite often, after the brainstorming phase was complete, the next stage was to pull together comprehensive documentation aligning all the major things they wanted to accomplish in the game, and this related not just to the narrative and its themes, but also how gameplay tied into everything. Kitase and Ito felt there were merits to this approach, but they chose to document far less, and the typical master document was never created to lead the way. They didn't want anything major to be set in stone at this point, and preferred to be much more adaptable to the whims of creativity as development commenced. And because of how young video games were as a medium, such a decision was crucial for allowing members of the team to flourish. Even though Final Fantasy was now moving into its 6th iteration, many of the original team who oversaw the creation of 1 through 3 had used the franchise as a stepping stone, before then going on to create their own franchises. Fortunately, such was the success of Final Fantasy III, that a whole new wave of talent was brought into the company. But because of how young the video games industry was, the lines of seniority that would often be there in other industries due to age just weren't all that visible. Senior members of the team were still relatively young, and this was evidenced by Kitase, who, despite being one of the younger members of the team, was given one of the most senior positions. He was also only 4 years younger than Sakaguchi, who at the time was only 31, yet was still in charge of budgets that were starting to skyrocket. It was perhaps because the staff had evolved so much that they collectively chose to rebel against elements that were deemed to be foundational to the franchise. Ever since Final Fantasy II, the question of what defined a Final Fantasy game had continued to persist. But now, there were plenty of egos involved, and those egos could be bucketed into 3 groups. Those who had been part of the original crew that worked on Final Fantasy 1 through 3, those who were part of the second generation of creators who had worked on Final Fantasy 4 and 5, and those who were just starting out and wanting to make a name for themselves. This could have caused mass conflict, as everyone had individual opinions about what a Final Fantasy should be. But instead, it led to a shared sentiment of wanting to try something new, as opposed to just wanting to copy what had been done before. They wanted to collectively challenge themselves. The first area that came into focus was the narrative connection with crystals and their emphasis on traditional sword and sorcery fantasy. The overriding sentiment was that this story device had been done to death, as crystals had been given a high degree of prominence in each of the 5 previous narratives, often being central to plot progression and in general serving as the main driving force behind the narrative. With their main competitor being praised so much for its narrative depth, it was felt that perhaps now was the time to explore something different, and this meant stepping away from crystals to see if they could tell an original type of story. This then facilitated a change of subgenre within the realm of fantasy. Previous games had always flirted with futuristic science fiction elements. The original Final Fantasy, for example, had the Flying Fortress, and Final Fantasy IV introduced the Lunar Whale alongside the ability to travel to and from the moon. This time, however, one of the team proposed the idea of creating something much more industrial. Aspects of this did evolve over time, as per Kitase and Ito's plans, but from the outset, this idea proposed that they try and figure out how to incorporate machinery into a fantasy world.
Do you have it?
We got it. Let's do this. New dino.
The art directors were then a prominent driver of this, as they wanted to introduce more of their personal interests into the aesthetic of the game, but there was also a belief that the sword and sorcery aesthetic was holding the franchise back, and that with technology and hardware specifications now being much more advanced, and with the team being more experienced, they could really challenge themselves to create a world that incorporated so many different themes all into one. This theme of then leveraging their experience with the hardware then manifested onto the playable characters and their gameplay functions. Final Fantasy IV and V had taken very different approaches to party setup, with 4 opting for a large, more restricted party, and 5 opting for a smaller party with a ton of variety due to that small party having access to an incredible number of jobs. In the past, the developers had often cut corners to hit deadlines or compensate for low specifications, but they no longer felt that was a barrier. This time, they therefore wanted to go big or go home by creating an expanded cast that dwarfed Final Fantasy IV alongside an expanded array of customization that was even more comprehensive than Final Fantasy V. Everything pointed towards a massive undercurrent of change, but these ambitions didn't come cheap, and even though Final Fantasy V had served as a massive upgrade on Final Fantasy IV, jumping from an 8MB cartridge to a 16MB one, Final Fantasy VI upped the ante again by requiring a 24MB cartridge, and this came with a pretty steep financial commitment from Square to make this happen. Sakaguchi, however, was more than happy to make such an investment in his team. He was confident that they could deliver on those initial objectives, and by placing his faith in Kitase and Ito, he was excited to see how they would approach their leadership roles as he stepped away from being so involved in the day-to-day. Sakaguchi was still involved though. He had always loved developing the narrative and had been directly or indirectly involved with establishing the premise and core themes of every previous game, even going so far as to write and adjust the script for some of them. Now in the role of producer, Sakaguchi again came up with the broad story premise, which, as they were moving away from having crystals be the driving force, was now going to revolve around what had often been a secondary narrative theme: rebels attempting to overcome evil imperial forces. It sounded simple on paper, as most narratives do when broken down to their basic components. But Sakaguchi and Kitase vowed that this time their narrative was going to be far more sophisticated than anything previously associated with the franchise. Final Fantasy IV had served as a significant turning point in this regard. Having taken the feedback from Kazuhiko Torishima to heart, Sakaguchi sought to enhance the quality of the scenario, and this saw them create an expanded cast whose fates were interwoven with each other and the world around them. Final Fantasy V then followed a similar approach, except this time the number of protagonists was reduced so they could each have more development, with the scenario itself also having a lot more depth with the way it connected to the world. The sentiment of character-driven stories was becoming more and more pronounced, and other development teams were even taking a similar approach, with Takashi Tokita, who had planned out the scenario of Final Fantasy IV, opting to take the notion even further when developing Live Alive, which happened concurrently and in isolation from Final Fantasy VI. In short, within Square as a whole, there was a want to transform characters from simply being vessels that were used to progress the overarching story. Instead, they wanted them to be seen as characters of substance, each with their own backstories that could be used to evoke different sets of emotions amongst the player base. And this was a huge point of differentiation. As those steps had been taken with Final Fantasy IV and V in this regard, Kitase and Sakaguchi felt that the narrative focus on the characters themselves was still one-dimensional and lacking. Based on that overarching objective, the decision was taken to introduce a huge cast of characters, with each one having a specific purpose within the story, and with the majority of them being developed in such a way that depending on the lens used by the player, it would be possible for each of them to be seen as the protagonist of the story. And this was a major difference from previous games, which had a canonically defined protagonist such as Bart or Cecil. Due to the scale of the task though, Kitase decided to adopt an innovative approach to development. It would have been easy for him, as the overlord in charge of drama, to create all the characters and then delegate their development to the team. But he took the opposite approach, putting faith in his team to collectively come up with the characters. This meant almost the entire development team, irrespective of department, then had a say in who these characters were and the creation of their identities and backstories, as opposed to it solely falling on the shoulders of, say, Sakaguchi or Kitase. Through this process, they ended up with almost 20 characters, with each one depicted at the stage by nothing more than playable class names. For example, one character was simply called Thief, while another was called Gambler. Once the array of characters was then established and everyone was happy, Kitase then opened up the floor for people from all across the development team to write short stories about these characters, which were meant to offer an identity and a hint at their backstory.
You only need a small dab to reduce the appearance of puffiness and dark circles.
That's exactly what I needed.
At Fanatics Sportsbook, every bet feels rewarding. Earn fan cash on your bets and use it to bet, boost, and collect across.
Tetsuya Nomura, one of the art directors, pitched in ideas for the Gambler, who became known as Setzer, and the Ninja, who was then named Shadow. Akiyoshi Ota, who was a battle planner, then proposed some ideas around the Painter, who was subsequently named Realm, and he naturally then took charge of Strago and all the NPCs associated with their story. Having seen some of her friends step up, Kaori Tanaka, aka Soraya Saga, who was a field graphic designer at the time, opted for the Monk and Machinist, who became known as Sabin and Edgar Figaro, and she then took on the responsibility of building out their characters, creating a considerable amount of depth for the brothers that went far above and beyond what was expected. Sakaguchi then took responsibility for developing the backstories of Terra and Locke, who were planned to be prominent characters, while Kitase, perhaps due to his wider role, looked after two playable characters who were supposed to have lesser roles in Celes and Gao, and the main antagonist, Kefka. Other characters such as Cyan and Mog were then picked up by other team members, but there were also characters who were proposed and then cut as the story developed, as they just didn't work with the way the scenario was progressing. Cyan, for example, was meant to have a close bond with a woman named Angela. Many of these decisions fell on Kitase as the scenario director. Even though each of the individual characters was overseen by a different member of the team, his job was to ensure the various arcs pulled together to make sense in the context of the wider narrative that was developing, but if they didn't, cuts had to happen. Perhaps the crucial part of this approach, however, was just its dynamic nature. As there was no set path for the story to take, there was a huge amount of fluidity, and everyone was able to riff off each other depending on developments that were being made elsewhere. And this then facilitated a ton of change, even within characters themselves. Terra, for example, underwent numerous revisions throughout development. From the outset, Sakaguchi always knew he wanted the character to be half human, half Esper, but nothing else was decided. In earlier drafts, this meant Terra was a man before being adjusted to a very sprightly young woman with short blonde hair. Locke also could have undergone changes too, but for very different reasons. As Square had become quite siloed following their new approach to development, even though Mystic Quest was a game that adorned the Final Fantasy name, because it was developed in near isolation by Development Team 6, aka Square Osaka, nobody in Development Team 1 had played the game or had any real clue about what the game contained. It wasn't until a significant amount of preparatory work had been done on Locke that someone on the team then actually played Mystic Quest in preparation for its Japanese launch, and they realised that throughout the localization process, the character called Tristan had been renamed to Locke, and that this version of Locke was also a treasure hunter. Upon making this realization, Sakaguchi made the creative decision to keep those aspects of Locke intact in Final Fantasy VI, but it highlighted the peril of video game development and secrecy in general. Their worst fear was working on something at the same time as one of their contemporaries, but then being accused of plagiarism or being derivative because a competitor had released their project first. But whereas Locke introduced a layer of stress for Sakaguchi, Mog was a more fun addition to the roster. By this point in the franchise, Moogles had started to become a recurring race. The initial plan was, of course, to have them appear within Final Fantasy II, but after they were replaced by beavers, the design was resurfaced for Final Fantasy III and was then reused in Final Fantasy V. This time, the developers wanted to give Moogles more prominence, and it saw the creation of a playable character called Mog. But to make Mog stand out, they decided to make some significant modifications, and this related to narrative context and also the design of Moogles in general. It saw the white, fluffy body retained, as well as the small wings. The dimensions were changed to make Moogles more slender. More focus was also placed on the Moogle's face, which now featured the squinted or closed eyes, and the wings were made smaller. Perhaps the most noticeable inclusion, though, was the pom-pom. This was a ball of fur on a long antenna, and it hadn't featured in any of the previous designs, but it helped to make the Moogle a bit more distinctive, and this made a huge difference to how audiences reacted to the character. One of the characters who saw the most change over time, however, was not Terra or Locke, or even Mog. Instead, it was Celes, a character given to Katase due to her role supposedly being quite small by comparison. At the beginning of the project, Sakaguchi had provided a rough outline of the scenario, and he fully expected this to be used as a guide as opposed to a hard and fast rule. There were, however, a few non-negotiable elements, and one of them was that an event scene needed to be created that took place in an opera. How and when this happened was left up to Katase, but its inclusion was mandatory, as Sakaguchi felt the potential spectacle could set Final Fantasy VI apart from its peers, and become a moment players talked about long after the game was released. Katase, however, had no clue about opera, and even though Sakaguchi did suggest that he attend some operatic performances in Japan so as to prepare, Katase just didn't have any time because development was so full on. The next best thing was therefore to collaborate with some team members who he hoped were at least somewhat knowledgeable on the subject, and he ended up spending days locked into deep brainstorming sessions with Nobuo Uematsu and Hideo Manaba, before then deciding to use a frame of reference he was comfortable with as the basis for the scene, a sequence from Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much.
Your upgrade is ready, Miss Langley.
My upgrade?
Yes, enjoy.
See y'all later. Experience the sounds of Nashville with Chase Sapphire Reserve.
The next question was then, who should serve as the focal point for this scene? As the overlord of the scenario, Katase from the outset attempted to remain as agnostic as he could to each of the characters, and this was for three reasons. One, he didn't want to be accused of favouring the characters he was working on. 2, he didn't want any of the other creators to feel as though their work was less or more important than any other, and 3, he wanted to make sure the scenario adhered to that original goal of having no defined protagonist. Every story was to have equal importance. This was why the assignment of Celes and Gao to Kitase was so important, as in Sakaguchi's initial story draft, neither were intended to have big roles in the story. They were instead included to help add colour to the wider lore of the world. There was just one problem. After Kitase started putting the script together, he felt Celes had a more important role to play. And after speaking with Sakaguchi about this, Kitase went with his gut, delving deep into the backstory of Celes and creating relationships that connected her with Kefka and with Locke. And it also meant that she was made the main focal point of the opera scene. With this decided, Kitase next had extensive meetings with Kazuko Shibuya to ensure a purposeful array of sprites was created that ensured everything looked just right for the operatic setting. After all the pieces were then in place, all that remained was to create the event sequence, and due to the importance of the task, Kitase chose to not delegate it to the team. Instead, he oversaw the entire sequence, frame by frame. There was a reason for this, however, and it had nothing to do with not trusting other members of the staff. Instead, it came down to Kitase's background in animation and the production of stop motion. Kitase was used to creating very detailed and intricate productions using stop motion techniques, and due to the length of the opera scene and how purposeful every single element was required to be, it needed a specialized attention to detail to ensure everything, no matter how big or small, was intentional. Every aspect of the sequence had to play its part to ensure it adhered to Sakaguchi's initial brief and lived up to expectations. The continual development of Celes then led to another purposeful inclusion. When the project started, there were never any plans for a world of ruin to exist. Kefka was supposed to be a traditional antagonist who just needed to be stopped, as had always been the case. But development progressed much faster than any of the senior team expected, and instead of shipping the game early, they decided to push things further. This would have never been possible had they opted for a static approach to development from the outset, but with Kitase preferring a dynamic approach, they just continued the story and wrote a second act that was never meant to exist. When someone on the team then proposed that perhaps they should actually just let Kefka win and have the second act deal with the fallout, they decided to plough ahead in earnest. Such a decision allowed for a considerable amount of character development, and one of the biggest beneficiaries of this was Celes. Due to how much Celes' role had grown, Kitase felt she deserved a scene that tugged on the heartstrings of those who had been sucked in by her narrative arc, and due to their connection via the Gestalian Empire, Kitase decided this sequence should involve Sid. The idea was to make something sincere and sad, but not hopeless, a perfect allegory for the situation the entire world found itself in. This meant that even though the canonical conclusion of Celes' arc was the death of Sid and her attempted suicide, it was possible to avoid this sequence by saving Sid's life, should the player figure out how to navigate the minigame that was stacked against them. Other characters were also given their moment in the spotlight, including the likes of Cyan, who could be involved in a small side quest that related to delivering letters to a widow, and this showed how much effort the scenario team and the individual creatives who built out their characters went to ensure that everything meshed together. But it also showed the brilliance and meticulous nature of Kitase, who, as a scenario director, was required to stitch everything together and adapt, expand, or truncate when necessary. This could not have been an easy task, given the size of the playable cast and the temporary cast, but also the huge array of NPCs that needed to be created. Compared to Final Fantasy V, the roster was significant, with many characters having NPCs that related specifically to their own story arcs. Setzer, for example, had a story that related to an NPC called Daryl, while Duncan and Vargas were important parts of Sabin's backstory. Other elements were also put in place to stoke mystery, with it being left up to the player to determine how certain narratives panned out, and in the case of Shadow and Realm, the relationships that existed between characters.
Ribeye steaks, drumsticks, Atlantic salmon.
Cover your week for less. It's an Aldi thing.
Check it out. Newest creative director of Ray-Ban, B. Wow, this is what you're doing, type. Man, I'm over here drawing and all that. We got opticals, very intelligent, a little elegant, you know what I mean?
Studious look.
Yeah.
With this.
As Kitase and other members of the team continued to organically develop the story, Hiroyuki Ito worked with his team to ensure that broader progression systems and combat application worked hand in hand, supporting the narrative wherever possible to create a cohesive experience. Due to the sheer size of the playable cast, it was decided early on that a traditional job system, the likes of which have been seen in Final Fantasy 1, 3 and 5, just wouldn't make sense. So they decided to build up the system adopted in Final Fantasy 4, where characters were given set jobs that they would keep throughout the entire duration of the playthrough. There was a risk that this may cut down on the volume of potential party configuration options, but due to the size of the cast, there was a sense that the game still had the capacity to offer a lot of variety with regards to playstyles, and they also made some purposeful changes in relation to how everything was implemented. The first major change was that they wanted to remove the restrictions imposed by Final Fantasy IV, whereby throughout much of the experience, players had a limited choice about how to solve the problems put before them. Final Fantasy V had been a breath of fresh air in this regard, and they wanted Final Fantasy VI to be similar. So even though there were certain story segments put in place that forced certain characters to be used, their impact was diminished, and outside of moments of learning, the player was afforded a lot more choice about the party they wanted to use, with some recruitable characters even being missable. The other major change came around character progression. In every prior game to Final Fantasy V, outside of Final Fantasy II of course, a character's ability set was always determined by their selected job, whether that be a fixed role or an adaptive one. Final Fantasy V then challenged this via the Mastery system, and it was this system that saw significant expansion. Every character did still have the capacity to learn new innate abilities as they grew throughout the game, but these abilities could now be supplemented with limited restrictions applied, and this was made possible through the expanded use of Espers. After being introduced in Final Fantasy III and their subsequent narrative involvement in Final Fantasy IV, the role and impact of summons had ended up being quite profound. In Final Fantasy VI, this notion was pushed even further, as summons, now known as Espers, were integrated into the story in a direct way by being connected to one of the game's main protagonists, Terra, and having their own world and society. But to make sure their impact was felt beyond the story, Espers were then retained as summonable beings and integrated into character progression. Ever since being promoted to oversee general gameplay, Ito had always attempted to make sure his systems acted as extensions of the narrative, and this time it saw Espers become equipable components, capable of teaching characters new spells and boosting attributes. Each Esper, via the Magicite system, was given a unique array of spells that could be taught. The caveat was that each Magicite could only be assigned to one character at a time. This meant players had to be strategic, as spells were not learned instantly. Such a system also facilitated a huge growth in the number of available summonable beings. This had already been steadily rising from the 8 that were introduced in Final Fantasy III, but Final Fantasy VI included more than 4 times as many, and some of them were incredibly powerful. To complement the Magicite system and provide even more options to players, Ito and his team also created relics, or accessories as they were known in the Japanese version of the game. Alongside innate abilities and learnt spells, relics were designed to provide special bonuses to players, and up to 2 could be equipped by any character. Some relics, for example, could be used to boost specific stats, while others protected against negative status effects or auto-casted positive ones. But there were also selections of relics that went far beyond this. A handful of relics, for example, were able to provide job-based functionality from previous games that was no longer accessible due to that system being removed. An example came via the sprint shoes, where if they were equipped, then they allowed the party to walk faster in towns and dungeons, just like had been possible in Final Fantasy V via the sprint ability that was previously exclusive to thieves. The Ward Bangle and Malulu's Charm also altered one of the fundamental mechanics that had been in place since the original game, by either halving the random encounter rate or removing random encounters completely. And then there was the Growth Egg, which doubled the EXP an equipped character received after every battle. Other relics, such as the Knight's Code, then brought back the cover mechanic, while characters who equipped the Dragoon boots saw their regular attack command changed into the jump command, meaning that every character could act like a Dragoon even though the job did not feature in the game. Other aspects the team wanted to explore related to difficulty. To ensure players were able to overcome problems, the aforementioned systems meant that magic was a command accessible to every character. Espers were not locked behind certain jobs either, and bespoke commands were added via relics. This meant there was a significant increase in the total number of commands available to almost every character. New attack states were also added, including player-led pincer attacks that could add a layer of strategy and ease depending on whether players were able to exploit the advantages of these new states. But above all else, the developers wanted to try and make the game easier to complete. The only challenge was accomplishing this without being accused of dumbing the game down. In the past, they had tried different approaches to solve this problem, including publishing a completely separate version of Final Fantasy IV called Easy Type, and by making Final Fantasy V very accessible, with extra layers of depth available for people who wanted it. Both of these approaches had their pros and cons, but it still felt like barriers may exist for people who weren't role-playing enthusiasts and may struggle to get through some of the encounters. Numerous ideas were proposed for how to make Final Fantasy VI even more accessible for those types of players, but one of the ideas that stood out came from Tetsuya Nomura. Nomura suggested that the player be given a brand new, unique ability that only triggered for players who were deemed to be struggling based on their current HP. It was a genius concept, as unlike suggesting the player should lower the difficulty, it was near impossible for this ability to be considered patronizing or demeaning. Instead, the ability served to empower players and make them feel amazing, just like when their favourite characters were beaten down in an anime, but then mustered up the strength to carry on and rise up to win against all the odds. The move ended up being called a Desperation Attack, dubbed a near-death special skill in the Japanese version, and each character was given one such skill, that had a 1 in 16 chance of being activated should they be below 1/8 of their maximum HP after 20 seconds of the battle commencing. Should the Desperation Attack then be triggered, players got to bear witness to attacks of incredible power. There were also amazing visual spectacles, and it ended up being quite a treat for those who ever got to see it. All things considered, these numerous tweaks to the battle scene and character progression helped to make Final Fantasy VI feel like a serious evolution on its predecessor, and this was accomplished even though the ATB system itself saw minimal improvements. This then showed the strength of that core system, but also the talent of the team at large.
Get your color back. From root to tip. Just for Men Gray Reverse.
Are you Marsha?
I am. I am.
Thanks for meeting me here.
To work alongside all the efforts made to ensure Final Fantasy VI delivered an impactful and compelling gameplay experience, a high degree of faith was also placed on the art and music departments to hold up their end of the bargain. Those artists who had shown real potential in Final Fantasy V were given purposeful promotions, and each of them was placed in charge of a different aspect. Kazuko Shibuya, for example, was now given much more autonomy than ever before, and this had a direct impact on the speed at which they were able to work. One of the first major decisions she made was to push for larger character sprites to be used. For a long time, the sprites had stayed within the same realm, but Shibuya felt larger sprites would allow for a greater level of fidelity amongst the cast, while also giving them more presence on screen. And with so many characters, both playable and non-playable, being created, being able to distinguish between them more easily was of paramount importance. The other major impact around Shibuya's autonomy and seniority was that she now also had more influence over the final product, and the individual designs of sprites that manifested in-game. In the past, Yoshitaka Amano's work had almost always been used as a reference for pixel artists, and even though Shibuya had sometimes provided the basis, such as her creation for the logo of Final Fantasy III, Amano was then tasked with cementing the concept and making the final version. This time around though, the workflow was different, as Shibuya and Amano were working in tandem as opposed to being part of the same linear chain. This meant conflicts had the potential to arise, and in those instances, Shibuya was given authority to overrule Amano, with her work deemed as the primary source. This situation ended up happening quite a few times, with two notable examples being with the Magitech armor and the design of Terra. Both times, Shibuya and Amano created different interpretations of the same thing, and it's why the in-game representation of the Magitek armor differs from the concept art, some of which appeared on the Japanese box art. Terra was perhaps the most pronounced change, however. Throughout the design process, Terra went through numerous revisions, not least because of the gender swap. After this, Terra was designed to be a young girl with short blonde hair, but Shibuya felt this wasn't unique enough and overruled Amano. She felt that too many characters had ended up with blonde hair, and so made the executive decision to switch Terra's in-game hair colour to green as a way of making her stand out more on the screen. The other, now senior artists, also took more responsibility for their own areas, and Tetsuya Takahashi in particular was known for speaking his mind and challenging decisions that were being made elsewhere. And this even saw him doing something that few dared, challenging Sakaguchi. Taking such a step was tantamount to career suicide given how much authority Sakaguchi wielded within the company. But whenever Takahashi felt passionate about something, he didn't just want to sit back and not act on his moments of inspiration. One such instance, a game related to the Magitek armor. Even though they already had two visual identities for this important piece of technology, Takahashi, who was put in charge of creating the game's opening sequence, where Magitek suits were to be shown walking through the snow, decided he liked neither Shibuya's design nor Amano's design. Takahashi himself had developed a huge fascination with mechs, and felt he could create a more compelling design. So despite being given strict instructions to follow Shibuya's existing designs to the letter, he took a huge risk and went against the directive. What Takahashi then delivered was stellar. He knew that coming to Sakaguchi with a half-baked product would never work, so he made it as good as he possibly could. And when he then showed it to his superiors, even though it went against everything that they had requested, they all had to admit, even Sakaguchi, that this new version was much better than what they had envisioned in the first place, even though it did introduce a third visual identity for the Magitek armor. This then typified the mentality of Development Team 1. They felt they were the best, and they wanted to prove it. In the past, people working in the presentation department often had to cut corners to hit deadlines or deal with technological limitations. But with many now working on their third game for the Super Famicom, they had developed new, efficient methods for producing assets, and this saw a fundamental shift in terms of how they all operated. Even though some elements may have resembled what was seen in previous entries, everything was reworked under the hood, rebuilt from the ground up to be way more efficient, and this then allowed them to pack so much more content into the game. Pride also came into play too. Numerous games went to market throughout production, but if any featured things that were similar or better than what the team were already working on, the decision was often taken to start again from scratch. Such an instance happened following the release of Yasumi Matsuno's Ogre Battle. After playing the game, Hirokatsu Sasaki, who was working on the creation of magic effects to be used within the battle scene, ended up scrapping almost all of his work. Because if they wanted to be seen as the best, they had to be the best. They couldn't afford to rest on their laurels. The other aspect of presentation related to music, and this was where some potential issues arose. Unlike many others of the team who were super enthused to be working on another Final Fantasy game, Nobuo Uematsu was not. Ever since joining Square, Uematsu had been given a relentless schedule, tasked with composing music for the vast majority of their games. This burden was softening slightly following the hiring of Kenji Ito, but Uematsu had still been required to compose the soundtracks for almost 20 games in just 7 years. Across the 5 Final Fantasy games alone, he had composed almost 5 hours of in-game music, with over 2 of those relating to Final Fantasy V. Countless more music had also been produced that just didn't make the cut, and it had all been composed with very tight deadlines, requiring near permanent residence at the office and many sleepless nights.
Roku's self-serve ads platform. It's easier than ever with Ads Manager. Sign up today.
What's going on there?
On top of that, Uematsu also had to create sound effects for some of these projects, all while being required to work on plenty of other supplemental content that was being produced in relation to his own works, such as the Symphonic Suite and the various arrangement albums that were now expected to be part of the pre- and post-marketing cycle for each game. The other strain was that alongside Sakaguchi, Uematsu was now the second most famous person at the company, and was often asked to do interviews due to his high profile within the video games industry. Following the completion of Final Fantasy V, Uematsu took all of this into consideration when thinking about what to do next. The grim reality of burnout was creeping in, and Uematsu was very close to quitting Square and the video games industry as a whole, hoping to move on and work in a less stressful environment. Sakaguchi and Kitase, however, convinced him to stay on for just one more project. The argument they used was that they felt Uematsu wouldn't want to look back at his career with regrets if he quit then, not when they were just about to work on what they believed to be their best ever game. They needed someone of his talents to bring everything together, and after being emboldened by their faith in him, Uematsu opted to stay, resolving to make the soundtrack of Final Fantasy VI something special, as it was probably going to be his last. Kitase and Ito, owing to their collaborative approach to leadership and development, then brought Uematsu more into the fold than he was ever allowed to be when Sakaguchi was sitting at the top of the tree, asking for his opinions on aspects of design that didn't just relate to music. This approach then invigorated Uematsu further. He was given room to experiment, and he genuinely felt as though his work would make a difference to the final product that extended beyond the realms of what he had accomplished in the past. This notion was evidenced through quite a few pieces of music, but perhaps the one that epitomized this the most was Dancing Mad. Just as with every other aspect of the game, this track was never intended to exist. But after the World of Ruin became a possibility, every single person on the team wanted to show just how far they could take things. This manifested via incredible scenario development for each character, some stunning visual designs such as the Tower of the Gods, which was created by Tetsuya Nomura, and Dancing Mad, a monumental piece of music due to how it was structured. Up until this point, final boss music had always been quite one-dimensional due to the battles themselves, but with Dancing Mad, Uematsu pushed everything to the next level, creating a multi-tiered piece of music that evolved as the battle itself evolved. It saw Uematsu compose a piece of music that clocked in at a staggering 17 minutes and 40 seconds in length, and everyone on the team was blown away. All of these elements combined showed just how much the team had grown. They had become efficient and adaptive, to the point that they were able to increase the scope of the game significantly, as the original scope had been accomplished in less than 6 months of development. It also showed the ambition though. They could have easily just stopped there and released a decent game, generating strong returns for the company, but none of them would have been satisfied with that approach. Their collective desire to become the absolute dominant force on the market pushed them to achieve greatness, and they demanded nothing but the best from each other. This was, however, a blessing and a curse, and development still had its ups and downs. Sakaguchi, for example, had to contend with the birth of his daughter Aya when they were knee-deep in development, and as the leader of the team, he couldn't afford to be distracted by this major life event. Because of how much extra work they'd done, the debugging phase also ended up being more brutal than with any previous game, as everyone was forced to pitch in, irrespective of their role. One of the biggest challenges then came around memory management optimization. The game was huge, and unlike today, where there are numerous tools that can assist with debugging, even though Square did have a dedicated testing team at this point, they had no tools or software to aid in the detection of bugs and errors. It was a manual process, and as the deadline approached, more and more bugs were found due to them relying so much on human judgment calls for memory management. It saw staff members with spare time pulled in from all corners to assist, including famed artists like Shibuya. She noted in an interview once just how relentless it was due to the tight deadlines. To paraphrase, she said, "I worked on it all night after night, but every morning they'd give me an updated ROM. Unfortunately, in a single day, someone as bad at games as myself could only reach the midpoint of Final Fantasy VI, where the world is destroyed. So every morning I'd come back to work for another day of debugging, feeling a little dejected, thinking, here we go again, another day of searching for Gao on the Veld." And this emphasized another problem. Every time an optimization was made, the game had to be playtested again to ensure it hadn't broken something else. Despite their best efforts, countless bugs made it into the final product, and some ended up becoming quite notorious, such as Vanish Doom, the Sketch Glitch, and a bug that affected the Cursed Shield. by the end, despite them being originally finished very quickly, Final Fantasy VI had ended up spending the longest time in development since Final Fantasy III. But the team were supremely confident with what they had produced and were eager for expectant fans to get their hands on the finished product.
Join Planet Fitness for 1 cent down, $15 a month. No commitment. Deal ends Friday, April 10th.
Canada Dry presents Tuesday.
After what felt like a smooth, but also very taxing and emotionally draining development cycle, thoughts moved over to the marketing team and how they were going to position Final Fantasy VI to an ever-expectant market. The previous installment had cemented Final Fantasy as one of the hottest properties, and fans were desperate for more, but choice decisions had to be made around how and when to ship the product. After all, they had chosen to take a slightly longer time developing Final Fantasy VI than initially intended, and they'd also opted to produce the game on a 24MB ROM cartridge, which increased production costs, and those needed to be passed on to the consumer. Dragon Quest also loomed as the elephant in the room, but Square were confident with their own product and the decisions they had taken, and decided to be bold and brash. One of the common themes over the past 5 years was that Yuji Horii and the marketing team over at Enix were always keen for consumers to be aware of what was on the horizon in relation to Dragon Quest. In the earlier days of the franchise, this had worked quite well as the games came thick and fast, but as development times got longer and longer, announcing their games early started to have the opposite effect. Consumers ended up getting burnt out by the constant prospect of news and then nothing significant being delivered as more and more time passed. With Dragon Quest V and Final Fantasy V releasing so close to each other, consumers then wondered which publisher would blink first by revealing their plans for the next iteration, and once again, it was Enix. During the summer of 1993, less than a year after the release of Dragon Quest V, Enix held a press conference where they announced that development had already commenced on Dragon Quest VI, and they sat in front of a general banner that offered no branding and only 2 small pieces of concept art. They stopped short of saying anything else of note. There was no planned release window revealed, nor did they talk about anything that the game planned to contain. The announcement was clearly designed to try and get ahead of their rival. Enix were beginning to feel threatened by Final Fantasy and wanted to ensure the conversation stayed with them, even if they had nothing significant worth talking about. Square, though, for their part, were more than happy to let Enix talk. After the release of Final Fantasy V, their internal focus shifted onto other properties, such as the next iterations into the Mana and Romancing Saga franchises. Both had the potential to be smash hits, and this proved to be the case when Seiken Densetsu 2 launched around the same time as that Dragon Quest III reveal. It sold over 500,000 copies during a 2-week launch period, with the figure rising to almost 800,000 within a month on sale. This was a significant result for Square, as the previous game, which had launched on the Game Boy, had only managed to sell 700,000 copies in its lifetime, and at less than half the price point. This saw the Mana franchise go from one capable of generating 3.4 billion yen during its lifetime to one capable of generating 7.8 billion yen in just 4 weeks. Final Fantasy VI was then announced right at the end of the year to coincide with the huge launch of Romancing Saga 2. It managed to perform even better than Seiken Densetsu 2, with 600,000 copies shipped within its first 2 weeks on sale. But Enix were also active around this period, releasing Illusion of Gaia and Dragon Quest I and II for the Super Famicom in the surrounding weeks. The promising thing for Square, however, was that neither of Enix's games were able to match the performance of Seiken Densetsu 2 nor Romancing Saga 2, and this showed that the consumer base had started to develop a closer affinity with games associated with the Square brand as opposed to them being from one specific IP. Similar to the reveal of Final Fantasy V, the marketing and publishing teams decided, along with Sakaguchi, that there needed to be a quick turnaround between announcement and launch. This was only possible, however, if the game was almost complete, and Sakaguchi wanted to ensure that the announcement was held back until at least 80% of production was done, leaving only finessing and debugging left to complete. Based on the size and strength of the brand, they believed this was the optimum approach. go huge with the announcement and bombard people with immediate reasons why they should play this game. By taking this approach, there was no room for people to gain incorrect assumptions about what the game may be, which in turn meant their expectations were less likely to be misaligned. Alongside a huge print spread which contained very detailed information about Final Fantasy VI, they then shocked audiences by revealing that despite being announced in December of 1993, Final Fantasy VI was going to be released just 4 months later, in March of 1994. The benefits of this approach were then laid bare. Dragon Quest VI had been a near permanent mainstay at the top of Famitsu's Most Wanted chart ever since its announcement during the summer. But within just 1 week, Final Fantasy VI had snatched its spot at the top, and it wasn't even a competition. Dragon Quest VI had been eclipsed, losing almost all of its momentum. Alongside the build-up to this reveal, the marketing department at Square had also been working hard on something that Sakaguchi had been clamoring for, a legitimate collaboration with Torishima and Jump Magazine. Ever since their fateful conversation following the release of Final Fantasy III, Torishima had been suitably impressed by what Square had accomplished with Final Fantasy IV and V, and he'd been so impressed that after seeing what was being worked on behind the scenes with Final Fantasy VI, that he finally gave the Final Fantasy brand his seal of approval. The resulting campaign was planned to be huge, and this was yet another body blow to Enix, as for the longest time, Dragon Quest had had near exclusive expanded coverage within Jump. What became known as the Final Fantasy Coliseum ended up as a comprehensive feature that was planned to last for an extended period that encompassed pre-launch and post-launch support. It saw unique comic strips produced to provide backstories on specific characters and draw the Shonen Jump audience in, while people like Sakaguchi and Kaori Tanaka answered mailbag questions, diving deep into the creative process for each character and revealing detailed lore information and how the characters had evolved throughout the development process. This was not the end of their efforts though. Square had become known for their impressive TV commercials, with Final Fantasy IV focusing on a real-life ostrich and Final Fantasy V using innovative computer graphics. To continue on with this theme, for Final Fantasy VI, they decided to create a live-action trailer. To ensure it retained the wow factor, the creative team decided to have Terra somehow be magically transported into modern-day Japan, all while riding the Magitech armor, just like in the box art and the game's opening sequence. Such a vision required the use of green screen technology and the hiring of a model who could serve as a realistic representation of Terra. After a search, they ended up hiring a 13-year-old French model called Audrey Drew, creating a suitably appropriate costume and allowing her to retain the blonde hair as opposed to dyeing it green to match the in-game representation. Alongside this, Square also produced 2 promotional soundtracks called Final Fantasy VI Stars Volume 1 and 2, and they also, in collaboration with V-Jump, produced a unique piece of music that featured the entire core development staff, and to make it even more endearing to would-be players, they even had the staff sing along, with Sakaguchi and Tetsuya Nomura performing the solo roles. All of this was necessary though, as not only did Square want to try and further close the gap to Dragon Quest, but they also had to try and get people so excited about the prospect of playing the game that they'd be forgiving about the incredible price tag that had been placed on the cost of entry. Due to the use of that 24MB cartridge, Square decided to hike the retail price up by a considerable margin, having chosen to pass on the extra cost to consumers, instead of absorbing it themselves. This meant Final Fantasy VI retailed for 11,400 yen, making it one of the most expensive games released on the system to that point. At the time, 11,400 yen was the equivalent of $110, but by today's money, when accounting for inflation, it meant Final Fantasy VI went on sale for the equivalent of $234. It was an incredible fee, but based on what Square had accomplished before with not just the Final Fantasy franchise, but also Romancing Saga and Mana, and the success of their short but sharp marketing campaign, people were willing to pay the fee. And this was in spite of the game being slightly delayed due to that extended debugging phase, with Square using the additional time to create even more hype. During its first 2 days on sale, Final Fantasy VI went on to sell 1,154,360 copies, with a further 600,000 copies sold over the next 14 days. This placed Final Fantasy VI well ahead of the likes of Seiken Densetsu 2 and Romancing Saga, but perhaps the biggest milestone was what it meant in comparison to Dragon Quest. Final Fantasy V had helped to close the gap, but Final Fantasy VI had sold at such a rapid pace that it had not only closed the gap completely, but created a new one where Dragon Quest was now the franchise that had to play catch-up. And what made this all the more impressive was that price point, as the feat had been accomplished despite retailing at almost 2,000 yen more than most other games on the market at the time. This then meant that Final Fantasy VI generated 22.6 billion yen, or just over $200 million, within its first 4 weeks on sale, an incredible accomplishment for any developer or publisher of video games at the time. Shortly after launch, reviews from professional critics then started to go live, and amongst them was a very commendable 37 out of 40 from Famitsu. There had been a gradual upward trend for Final Fantasy games ever since the original game had scored 34 out of 40, but Final Fantasy V had represented a regression in this regard. Final Fantasy VI addressed this decline and also set a new benchmark, surpassing the scores of 36 out of 40 that were achieved by Final Fantasy III and IV. Amongst the 4 reviewers, 2 gave it a perfect score, and there were plenty of plaudits. Hirokazu Hamamura, for example, said that Final Fantasy VI had challenged the conventional frameworks of role-playing games, while also challenging what it meant to be a Final Fantasy game. But due to a combination of its presentation and story, it had succeeded, surpassing everything previously associated with the franchise to define a new path forward. Miki Watanabe, one of the 2 who awarded the perfect score, lamented only having limited space to convey her thoughts within the magazine. And this was because the graphics, battle sequences, and scenario were simply stunning and amazing to her. Everything sounded very positive, but consumers who purchased the game weren't quite as sure. When readers of Family Computer magazine provided their thoughts across 6 standard categories of characters, music, value for money, operability, immersion, and originality, Final Fantasy VI actually scored worse than Final Fantasy V in every single category. The area that lagged behind this the most was value for money, something that perhaps wasn't too surprising given the significant hike up in price point. Regardless, by the end of the Super Famicom's life cycle, Final Fantasy VI ended up selling 2.55 million copies. This was more than Final Fantasy V, but only just, with the difference being only 100,000 copies. The most important metric for Square was the revenue. Due to its high price point, this meant Final Fantasy VI generated approximately 29 billion yen, compared to Final Fantasy V's 24 billion yen. And at the time, this was the equivalent of almost an extra $100 million. The results of Final Fantasy VI meant it was by far the best performing commercial product Square had ever produced, and when combined with the returns from Romancing Saga 2 and Seiken Densetsu 2, both of which also grossed over $100 million each, it saw these 3 games alone generate well over $500 million in Japan, the equivalent of around $1.2 billion in today's money, when factoring in inflation. With such strong performance under their belt, Square then turned their attention back to the challenge they had struggled to overcome, replicating this success in North America. After the release of Final Fantasy IV as Final Fantasy II, Square had gotten themselves into something of a muddle with regards to the North American market. Even though not much physical time had passed between the releases of Final Fantasy on the Nintendo Entertainment System and Final Fantasy II on the next generation of consoles, consumers just hadn't become as enthused about playing role-playing games on consoles as they had in Japan, and the 2 games also didn't feel that similar. This wasn't all that surprising, given that 2 of the Japanese entries had been skipped, and all of these factors combined to see the North American release of Final Fantasy IV sell around 2/3 of its predecessor. Mystic Quest was then created to try and help solve the problem, but even though it did sell more copies than Final Fantasy IV, its lower price points saw it generate less revenue. Plans were in place to release a localized version of Final Fantasy V, but after seeing how much Mystic Quest had floundered, these plans were eventually shelved, as they thought it had much less chance of resonating with the North American audience than Final Fantasy VI, which placed more emphasis on narrative and less on systems. After the decision had been made, responsibility was then turned over to Ted Woolsey to localize the Japanese script into English. Ted had already done some provisional work on Final Fantasy V, but his main contributions after joining Square's North American division came on Mystic Quest and Seiken Densetsu 2, which was localized as Secret of Mana for its North American launch. For Final Fantasy VI, the localization was expected to happen at a rapid pace. They just didn't want to lose a march, especially as conversations were already starting to progress towards the next generation of consoles, and as history had shown, sales had the potential to dip down once consumers started to have their heads turned by more ambitious and technologically advanced software. With these factors combined, Ted was only given 30 days to produce a complete localization of Final Fantasy VI, with no time to prepare beforehand and no chance to speak with the development team to ask questions or explain certain aspects of the story. There was also no real guidance put in place around continuity. Instead, Ted was given complete autonomy to change aspects to ensure they resonated more with the target market based on his own experiences. It was a gargantuan task, but Ted stood up to the plate and attempted to deliver as best as he could. But almost as soon as he started, the lack of possible communication with the team in Japan led to immediate problems being encountered, and perhaps one of the most pronounced was around names and general naming conventions. Due to the way both languages worked, conveying the same intention often became challenging due to character restrictions, and this issue became more pronounced within the battle scene, as there was limited space within the user interface. In Final Fantasy IV, for example, a strict 8-character limit was imposed on enemies, and although this was increased to 10 characters for Final Fantasy VI, it still caused issues between Japanese and English because many Japanese katakana symbols contained 2 letters. The infamous Great Maw, for example, was named in the Japanese version using 8 characters. The straight Romaji interpretation then expanded this to 15 characters, and in English, Great Maw itself is 12 characters, including the space. Ted therefore had to come up with a creative interpretation for how to shrink this down. And there were countless instances of this, with another being Tyrannosaurus, a word that is represented in katakana using only 8 characters.
When we first started working together, I'm checking it every day. I'm like, I don't know, was this the right
told you not to check it every day.
What made you get into doing what?
To solve the problem, Ted sometimes just created a shortened version of the word by removing spaces, double letters, or unnecessary vowels and letters. Tyrannosaurus, for example, was shortened to Tyrannosaur. Other words were more complicated, however. The Tombre, for example, was a brand new creation for Western audiences, having debuted in Final Fantasy V. But it was often difficult for Ted to understand whether words were meant to be literal or figurative. So instead of doing a straight translation of Tombre, he had to make a judgment call, and this sometimes led to enemies being completely renamed. This saw the Tombre became known as a Pug, and the aforementioned Great Maw being renamed as the Evil Oscar. The other major consideration came with name changes to specific playable characters and NPCs. In Japan, giving characters names like Tina, Dean, and Jeff had a notion of fantasy, as those names were so uncommon in that specific country that they felt majestic and in keeping with the fantasy genre. But in North America, the opposite was true. Those names were incredibly common, and in no way did they represent fantasy. They were much closer to reality. To reintroduce the element of fantasy, Ted felt compelled to change some of the character names, but this wasn't a decision he made on his own. When doing initial playtests in North America, they retained the name of Tina in association with one of the game's main protagonists, but every single individual who took part in the playtests hated the name. It was for this reason that Tina was changed to Terra, but other names ended up being changed for similar reasons. Amongst the playable cast, even though North Americans came to know the Figaro brothers as Edgar and Sabin, in Japan they were known as Edgar and Mash. Generic English names such as Dean, Billy, and Jeff were changed to Dwayne, Baram, and Gerard respectively, as they felt the names were far too common and they wanted to avoid a situation where players encountered someone with a similar name to someone they knew in real life. There was also another objective, as they knew many people liked to rename existing characters to names that meant something to them, and they wanted to avoid Locke, for example, being renamed by someone to Jeff, and then there being another Jeff that they encountered as an NPC in the game. It wasn't just the English names that were changed though, as Japanese names such as Jun, Shun and Mina were changed to Arvis, Owain and Elaine. Alongside this, Ted also had to contend with Nintendo's notoriously difficult rules around censorship, as alongside affecting visual assets, it also affected written assets. It saw the enemy named Virginity, for example, renamed to Madame. But they also had to rename spells such as Holy and Death, and pubs were even changed to being called cafes. This part was perhaps the most stressful too, as due to the tight turnaround times there was no room for error. Ted had to try and preempt as many of these censorship changes as possible to ensure it passed without needing multiple revisions. With everything progressing well though, Square's North American division was much more confident than they were with previous releases, and it saw them greenlight the production of a full-on television commercial that they hoped would help the game appeal to younger audiences. Channeling the attitude of that era, which had been most personified by the introduction of Sonic the Hedgehog, it saw Morg promoted to a starring role, as he served as a casting director for the game's various monsters. The tone was aggressive and full-on, and had very little to do with the actual game itself, but that was on purpose. They hoped the advert would draw kids in before the game itself did the job of getting them hooked and retaining them. When Final Fantasy VI then released, critics were impressed by what they saw. EGM awarded it a 36 out of 40, with all 4 review editors giving it a 9 out of 10. Dayton Carpenter even said it was a killer role-playing game that few companies would ever be able to match. Each of them also listed it amongst their current favourite games alongside the likes of NBA Jam, Super Metroid and Darkstalkers. Other publications also offered similar commendations, with Video Games Magazine awarding Final Fantasy VI Role-Playing Game of the Year, and it receiving the same commendations from EGM following unanimous voting from the editors. However, despite all the positive praise and promotional activities, Final Fantasy VI yet again struggled to find its feet in North America. And whereas the Japanese launch had led to more than 2.5 million copies being sold in that region, in North America it only ended up as the 8th best-selling game to launch in that year. This could have been seen as impressive, as the game only launched in October, but its sales were way down on the likes of Mortal Kombat 2 and Donkey Kong, and based on estimates, only around 300 to 400,000 copies were ever sold in the region, which was in the same ballpark as Final Fantasy IV and Mystic Quest. This meant that despite everything Square had done, the brand had not grown by any noticeable metric in that region.
I can't afford therapy. You can afford that matcha smoothie. Therapy is for rich people. No, it's like $15 a session. Girl, you gotta get therapy.
With Rula, getting help is...
In and around the launch of Final Fantasy VI in both Japan and North America, Square attempted to cement its legacy by producing plenty of supporting material. And as the game became available in more regions and on more consoles, this notion has only increased over time, bolstered by the near constant appearance of Final Fantasy VI in lists that talk about not only the best games in the franchise, but also the best games of all time. This then speaks to that original objective the developers had at the beginning of the project, and the continued conversation around Final Fantasy VI proves how successful they were, as the game has endured across its numerous re-releases and revisions. In Japan, Square did everything they could to channel hype within the short window they had given themselves. Some of the strong initiatives related to the Final Fantasy original video animations that aired around the same time as Final Fantasy VI launched, as well as adaptations of Final Fantasy VI itself within VJump. But due to how much some of the staff cared about these initiatives, they weren't just happy to be passive. Keiro Tanaka, who worked on developing the scenarios relating to the Figaro brothers, epitomized this. After contributing to an interview series within VJump called the Final Fantasy Colosseum alongside her boss Sakaguchi, Tanaka decided to go further by producing her own adapted works that were not deemed an official part of the Final Fantasy VI canon. Doujinshi had been a popular medium for some time after gaining prominence in the 1980s, and Tanaka had been active in their creation. But having been so involved in Final Fantasy VI, she felt there were stories that needed to be told in relation to the Figaro brothers that had no specific place within the game itself, and with no other collateral being produced, this left Tanaka to self-publish works that were her own and were not directly affiliated with Square. Entitled The Marriage of Figaro, Tales from the Desert, one of the stories featured plenty of characters from within the game itself, such as the Figaro brothers, Duncan Harcourt and Vargas, but also Gao, Cyan and Realm. But it also went much further. This saw many other members of the Figaro family introduced, including King Stuart and Queen Christiol, Edgar and Sabin's mother and father, alongside their uncles, aunts, cousins, and even grandparents. It helped to explore the impetus for Sabin's martial arts training in more detail, while also detailing the perilous Game of Thrones that was taking place, with Stuart's own brother plotting to take the throne before the king's untimely death at the hands of the Castalian Empire. The entire premise was fascinating, but because the book was published without the permission of Square, Tanaka was keen to note that it was an unofficial work and should therefore not be considered canon to the events of the game itself. Another staff member who embodied this notion was, of course, Nobuo Uematsu. Music had played a prominent part in the success of Final Fantasy, and fans had clamoured to gain access to the associated soundtracks. In the earlier years of the franchise, they were often left waiting quite a while. But as things had advanced, the marketing department realised that releasing original soundtracks ahead of a game's launch was the perfect way to generate a ton of extra revenue and build hype even further. This meant that instead of releasing on launch day, as they had done with Final Fantasy V, the original soundtrack for Final Fantasy VI launched over a week before the game, and hardcore fans who wanted to absorb everything they could about the game leapt on this official product, hoping it would satiate their cravings ahead of the actual game launching. By taking this approach, even though Final Fantasy VI as a game didn't end up selling many more copies than Final Fantasy V, the soundtracks did by comparison. This meant they increased the sales from 135,000 copies of Final Fantasy V soundtrack to 175,000 copies with Final Fantasy VI's soundtrack. As it was also listed at a price point of 3,800 yen, this saw the soundtrack generate 665 million yen, or the equivalent of $6.5 million at the time. And given that this was only a supplemental piece of content, such results were pretty astounding. Post-launch, excitement around the music was then enriched through the release of countless other albums that were atypical of what had been released with the two previous games. Within a few weeks of the game's launch, Square first released Final Fantasy VI Special Tracks, a short album that contained the infamous V-Jump musical track where the entire staff were singing, alongside some unreleased town themes and a pleasant remake of Troy and Beauty from Final Fantasy IV. The final piece was then an arrangement of Techno de Chocobo using modern synths that was arranged and performed by an outfit called the Voodoo Brothers. Final Fantasy VI Special Tracks was then quickly followed up by Final Fantasy VI Grand Finale, and this fulfilled a similar slot occupied by Celtic Moon with Final Fantasy IV and Dear Friends with Final Fantasy V. However, this time Uematsu worked with Shiro Sagetsu and Tsuneyoshi Saito from Sony Records to produce comprehensive arrangements that were akin to the Symphonic Suite. These arrangements were worked on well ahead of the game's launch before being recorded by the Orchestra Sinfonica di Milano towards the middle of March, weeks before the game had even shipped. Its sales were nowhere near as strong as those of the main soundtrack, but by selling almost 34,000 copies in Japan, its sales did surpass those of Celtic Moon and Dear Friends, generating over 100 million yen, or the equivalent of over $1 million. In June, 2 months after the game's launch, Square then released the Final Fantasy VI Piano Collections. The format remained the same as the two previous albums, but this time a different arranger was used. Instead of using Shiro Sato, it saw the talents of Shiro Sagetsu used instead, perhaps because of his familiarity with the soundtrack already, having worked on Grand Finale, but Sagetsu's role as the arranger on this production was uncredited for many years. On the same day, Square also went live with another arrangement album called Prey. Unlike many previous albums, this was not exclusive to a single game, instead spanning the entire 8-bit and 16-bit era, introducing vocals to many of the more emotional and melodic tracks. These were worked on by Yuriko Yamabuki alongside a handful of other arrangers. Despite how new it was relative to the other games, Final Fantasy VI was represented with 2 tracks, Tina's theme, which had quickly become a fan favourite, and Kids Run Through the City Corner. Most of these activities were focused on Japan, where the game had been a huge success, but Square had not given up on North America. After the series exploded in that region following the release of Final Fantasy VII, they sought to re-release Final Fantasy VI in that market, hoping to expose the countless new fans they'd obtained to what many felt was the best prior entry. In the build-up to the launch of Final Fantasy VII, Square were taking part in one of their regular question and answer sessions with investors. A big part of this was around their upcoming pipeline and support for platforms outside of the PlayStation. These included the Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, Windows 95 PCs, and Macintoshes. In answering, the representative from Square was quite blunt. They said support for the Super Nintendo had ceased immediately, and they had no plans to produce cartridge-based games for the Nintendo 64. But they may open a dialogue with Nintendo around supporting the proposed Nintendo 64 Double D attachment. They also said that support for the Macintosh was unlikely, but that for Windows, they were already planning a port of Final Fantasy VII, as well as ports of Final Fantasy V and VI, with the 6th port penciled to release in the first quarter of 1998. This ambition, however, was never realised. It's unknown who was working on the PC port of 6, but it's safe to assume it was one of either Top Dog or Eidos, as they had both attempted to port Final Fantasy V before failing in that endeavour. The PC port of Final Fantasy VI is therefore presumed to have been cancelled following their difficulties porting Final Fantasy V. Due to how much of a struggle it was to produce functional ports for the PC, Square decided to use what had been done as a foundation for a port of Final Fantasy VI on the PlayStation instead. In Japan and North America, this port was released in 1999, but different strategies ended up being adopted.
New Little Caesars 4-in-1 sticks is perfect for sharing.
Ooh, Sharon? I'm right here.
No, I said sharing.
Whereas in North America it was only available as part of the Final Fantasy Anthology, alongside Final Fantasy V, in Japan it was part of the Final Fantasy Collection, which contained enhanced ports of Final Fantasy IV, V, and VI. But alongside the Final Fantasy Collection, it was also possible for consumers to buy each game independently. For this release, the plan was to introduce some quality of life improvements, while introducing high-quality FM sequences that were designed to help bring the 2D characters to life, and ensure that those who were playing the games for the first time, presumably after also playing Final Fantasy VII or VIII, felt a bit more at home with the experience. The major downside, however, was that Final Fantasy VI was designed for the Super Famicom, not the PlayStation, and Toei, the company put in charge of the port, struggled to ensure a smooth transition. As a ROM-based platform, the Super Famicom had lightning-quick load times, and this enabled fast transitions between the various scenes that were adopted. The CD-ROM format, however, was much slower at reading information, and this meant the PlayStation version of Final Fantasy VI had much slower load times than its original. Perhaps due to extra logistics relating to localization, the European launch on the PlayStation came 3 years after the Japanese version, and it was only available as a standalone package, as opposed to being bundled with another game. Kind of, as instead of being packaged with Final Fantasy IV or V, it came with a playable demo of Final Fantasy X. Due to the delay, Square were able to fix some of the issues with the original port, however, with Toei having found a way to remove a lot of the load time issues that plagued the Japanese and North American versions. Some years later, Final Fantasy VI Advance was then launched as the last part of the finest Fantasy for Advance series, but the wait was worth it for fans of the original game. Countless enhancements were made to this particular version, and they related to almost every aspect, from visuals through to localization, quality of life adjustments, and even bonus content. On the visual side, work was done to improve sprites from the original game, and backgrounds were also enhanced by increasing the brightness and offering more vibrant colours, and portraits were created for important characters. Adjustments were made to the original Japanese script for its release in that region, but outside of Japan, Square Enix commissioned the creation of a brand new English script. This was overseen by Tom Slattery, and with the benefit of time and more open dialogue with the people who worked on the original game, it was made much more faithful to the original Japanese source. Much of the word-based censorship was also reverted. Perhaps the most notable aspect of Final Fantasy VI Advance, however, was the extra content. 4 new espers were added, alongside the Dragon's Den, which featured the previously cut Kaiser Dragon and the Soul Shrine. These were then accompanied by new ultimate weapons, which gave veterans something extra to enjoy outside of the main campaign itself. Earlier in the same year that Final Fantasy VI Advance launched, Square Enix has also started a new line of titles by releasing the Final Fantasy III Remake. This was then followed up by a Final Fantasy IV Remake, and there was a strong assumption that remakes of Final Fantasy V and VI were to follow soon after. But despite Square Enix having that same ambition, those remakes never materialized. Having seen the 2 previous games, Tomoya Asano and his team did not want to continue just remaking older properties. Instead, they wanted to use everything they'd learnt to make an original Final Fantasy game, and this became known as Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light. But this decision left Square Enix in a bit of a pickle. Due to how lucrative the Final Fantasy 3 and 4 remakes had been, they still wanted to further capitalize by producing remakes of Final Fantasy 5 and 6, but they now lacked a suitable partner to do the work. According to Shinji Hashimoto, they did explore creating the games with a new partner, but after they encountered technical issues, the projects ended up being delayed and then quietly cancelled. And now, some 30 years later, we are still yet to see any form of remake for Final Fantasy 5 or 6. In lieu of a proper remake, Square Enix instead chose to focus their efforts on attempting to modernize the original version of Final Fantasy VI, and their attempt came to market in 2014. This new version was developed from scratch for iOS and Android devices, and it featured quite a few changes that were meant to further enhance the project. New character sprites were designed, and everything about the visuals were made higher resolution. The version also added achievements, auto-battle functionality, and 8-way movement, allowing characters to walk diagonally. Some of these changes were welcome, but there was a general vibe of negativity around this particular port, especially when it launched on PC at a later date, as some aspects of the visuals just didn't look good in comparison to the original. And it was perhaps for this reason that this version of Final Fantasy VI ended up being phased out in favour of promoting the version that appeared as part of the Pixel Remaster collection. In the middle of 2021, Square Enix announced that they were creating new versions of the 8-bit and 16-bit era games to ensure they all had the same consistent identity. This saw changes made to graphics and sound, but there was a strong promise that all other aspects of the game were to remain faithful to their original launches. This meant that all bonus content introduced throughout the PlayStation, WonderSwan, Game Boy Advance and smartphone eras was to be removed, and this related to FMV sequences, additional bonus dungeons, and also super bosses. The challenge was that despite their claims about everything remaining faithful, this was only true until it wasn't. For example, they introduced a whole new HD 2D sequence for the opera scene, which was pretty incredible, but they also adopted a host of quality of life changes that affected gameplay. For example, the battle speed option within the menu had its functionality changed, and stats for every character were capped. They also gave prompts to Sabin's Blitz command, as opposed to requiring players to just know the combinations, and adjusted how Cyan's Bushido worked. Further adjustments were then made when the Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster launched on home consoles, such as the ability to adjust EXP gains, disable random encounters, and fixing the font that plagued the original release. Each revision has created different sentiments and preferences, but one common thread has been retained. Over time, Final Fantasy VI has stood out against its 8-bit and 16-bit contemporaries. When placed within that group, it's often the best regarded, and this was all thanks to the initial brash and bold objective of not just making a good role-playing game, but making a great game that was able to stand out against its peers then and in the future, irrespective of the genre. Final Fantasy VI delivered on this objective on almost every front. It featured a memorable cast of characters, each with their own unique and interesting story sequences, intriguing and innovative gameplay systems, some of which were either adapted or became staples moving forward, and a soundtrack that pushed what people felt was even possible within a video game through its diversity and also its adaptability through tracks like Dancing Mad. It was through these elements and the compounded notion of improvement through quick, high-quality releases that Final Fantasy managed to close the gap on its closest competitor, Dragon Quest. And as thoughts moved into the future, Final Fantasy continued to look forward, hoping to reach even greater heights. Thank you all so much for watching, everyone. My name is Daryl, and this has been the complete history of Final Fantasy VI. Hopefully, as you watched through the video, you found some interesting nuggets of information that perhaps you didn't know before. If you did, then please consider showing us how much you appreciate the effort that's put into researching, writing, and editing this video by giving it a like. In truth, all interactions you make really help the channel out, so if you do genuinely appreciate what we produce, please do let us know. We're also very grateful for the support we receive on Patreon and YouTube memberships. At the beginning of the year, I was unfortunately made redundant, and support from people on Patreon and YouTube memberships has been incredible, and it's really helped to make things a lot more sustainable financially. If you love this kind of content and are excited to see us dive into the PlayStation era, then we'd very much appreciate any support. Final Fantasy V has had a much stronger enduring. As the Super Famicom had started to become the system of choice for many households in Japan, Final Fantasy IV was one of the early standout video games available for the system. Its tumultuous development cycle had ultimately not impacted the quality of the final product, and with strong review scores and even stronger sales, there was a real sense that their decision to make a more story-driven game had worked. These aspects emboldened the team and further cemented Final Fantasy as not just one of the premium role-playing franchises to come out of Japan, but one of the premium video gaming franchises. This placed more pressure on Square, as the ever-curious gaming public were desperate for more information about what they were planning next. But there was also added pressure, because the hugely anticipated Dragon Quest V was still very much under wraps, and everyone was keen to find out how that franchise was going to transition into the 16-bit era. But as a company and as a team, those at Square felt they were more than up to the task of matching expectations. After taking some time off to rest and recuperate, the core development staff then returned. They went back to the drawing board, hoping to make a new role-playing game that could surpass what Final Fantasy IV had accomplished. But they were also desperate to continue closing the gap on their biggest rival. This ambition led to a heated battle that then concluded at the end of 1992, as the fifth entries of both powerhouse franchises went head-to-head. But after the dust had settled, Final Fantasy V was still standing tall. After the launch of Final Fantasy IV, the Super Famicom only continued to grow from strength to strength. Countless high-profile games were launched, such as The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, and Super Formation Soccer, and the install base grew to levels that far surpassed anything the Famicom had accomplished, both in Japan but also in North America. Based on this, and the strong residual sales of Final Fantasy IV, which saw it continue to sell throughout the summer and beyond, Square felt justified in their decisions around cancelling the Famicom version of Final Fantasy IV and rebranding Final Fantasy V as Final Fantasy IV. Ultimately, Final Fantasy was now one of the premium IPs associated with Japanese video gaming, but to ensure a solid growth trajectory for the company, there was a realization that they couldn't just rely on one major IP. Even though performance of Final Fantasy was on an upward trend, the difficulty of continuing that trend was not to be underestimated. Sakaguchi and his team were under incredible pressure to ensure they continued meeting the expectations of their fans, and although there was a high degree of faith that this could be accomplished, should they fail, an incredible burden would befall the rest of the company. It just so happened, however, that Square had already been developing a second property that had been performing on par with Final Fantasy in terms of sales. It's just that the revenue was less due to the games being sold on the Game Boy and therefore retailing at a lower price point. The first two Saga games had been a huge hit in Japan, with the initial game serving as the first property produced by Square to sell over 1 million copies. But the Saga games, which were rebranded as Final Fantasy Legend, also performed well in North America, posting strong sales and even winning awards. The impressive aspect, however, was that Saga embodied the spirit of Square around that time. Ever since the breakout success of Final Fantasy, the company had been in a constant state of flux. Huge restructures had taken place to support the development of Final Fantasy as an IP. But when opportunities arose, individuals were given license to explore on their own. That was how Saga ended up being born, as even though Akitoshi Kawazu had been tasked with creating a rival to Tetris, he decided to build on the work he'd done for Final Fantasy II to create an offshoot role-playing franchise that retained a lot of the same design principles, but was also something quite different from what would become a typical Final Fantasy game. The exploration of these themes then continued with Saga 2, which was a direct successor. But after the release of Saga 2, the decision was taken to try and elevate what Saga was. The higher-ups at Square wanted to create a second franchise that had the same prestige and selling power as Final Fantasy. To maximize this, even though Saga did continue on the Game Boy, with Square Osaka being placed in charge of developing Saga 3 and wrapping up that particular narrative arc, Kawazu was tasked with creating a brand new home console iteration of Saga under the new, revised branding of Romancing Saga. This then served as an amped-up successor to Saga 2, and this showed how intentional Square was as a company. Even though they had grand ambitions, there was a method to their madness. The Final Fantasy and Saga franchises had a very close relationship with each other, with Final Fantasy and Romancing Saga serving as distant cousins. Square even produced a graphic that highlighted the development relationships that existed between the two brands, and this even showed that they saw Final Fantasy IV as a spiritual successor to both Final Fantasy II and III, as it incorporated the best parts of both games to create something different. Journalists at Famitsu even joked that because Romancing Saga and Final Fantasy II shared a lot of the same principles, that if you evolved Final Fantasy II and placed it on the Super Famicom, the result was likely to have been Romancing Saga. It was perhaps for this reason that upon launch, Romancing Saga ended up being a huge success. Although critics were not all that favourable, with Famitsu scoring it a 31 out of 40, sales were incredibly strong. Romancing Saga outsold Final Fantasy II by over 200,000 copies, and due to its higher price point, it generated almost double the revenue, while also becoming the highest grossing Saga game ever released up until that point. It was also the fastest selling Super Famicom game on record, outside of Super Mario World, selling almost 3 times more than Final Fantasy IV did in its first week on sale. Square had their second major IP, and the beauty of this was that even though it existed in the same space as Final Fantasy, it catered to a different need, as while both games did feature turn-based combat, one had linear progression and storytelling, while the other was almost a complete polar opposite. The success of Romancing Saga showed that Square, as a company, had a lot to offer the role-playing genre, but the big two franchises were still Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, and after the release of Final Fantasy IV, the soft rivalry that existed only became even more apparent. Due to how much interest there was around each of the franchises, starting with issue 136 of Famitsu magazine, the decision was taken by the editorial team to produce purposeful weekly updates on both franchises. Such a decision had never been taken before, as Famitsu preferred to provide very varied coverage, but they just couldn't ignore how much further there was. Fans were just desperate to learn more. The premise was quite simple. Each of the columns was designed to give consumers the feeling that they were indirectly connected with both Square and Enix. Fans were able to write in to ask questions, and where possible, the editorial staff then tried to get answers to those questions from members of the development teams. The publishers also had the opportunity to fill the columns with additional lore details relating to recently released games or upcoming games, and there were also times where fans took over completely to talk about their hopes and dreams for how they wanted Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest to develop. The main point of note, though, was that Dragon Quest always came first in the publication, and perhaps as a way of emphasizing its place as the dominant franchise of the two, its branding and styling was also different. Whereas the so-called Final Fantasy newspaper was given a modest logo with no specific iconography, the DQ Times was given much more attention, even featuring specific lettering to make it look like a traditional print newspaper. It was during one of these Final Fantasy newspaper segments towards the end of 1991 that Sakaguchi was quizzed on the future of the franchise. Famitsu posited that they'd heard the Final Fantasy franchise had concluded and that no fifth entry was even being planned. In response, Sakaguchi simply stated, "You're incorrect. we don't plan to stop with Final Fantasy IV, so rest assured, the franchise is going to continue. With everything that happened throughout the development of Final Fantasy IV, including the cancellation of the Famicom version, the adaptation of the Super Famicom, and the tight turnaround times, by the time the game had shipped, the entire team was exhausted. Staying true to their initial mantra when developing the first Final Fantasy, they had left nothing on the table. Final Fantasy IV had combined elements from Final Fantasy II, 3, and the cancelled Famicom iteration of Final Fantasy IV to create something that was wholly unique in the franchise. They had pushed themselves to the absolute limit of their creativity, passion, and sheer capacity to work. But when the game launched, the dedication of their craft was clear as day. As a thank you for their efforts, the entire development team was given 3 months off to try and rest and recuperate. But when they returned, the challenge laid out was they now had to try and create a new Final Fantasy game that topped everything that they had previously accomplished. The first part of the equation was building the team. Ever since Final Fantasy had become franchised, Sakaguchi felt it was important to have a balance within the development team. He, alongside a few other senior figures, were designed to serve as the core spine, as they knew and understood the DNA of Final Fantasy. But that spine could rotate. In the preceding years, the likes of Koichi Ishii, Akitoshi Kawazu, and Hiromichi Tanaka had made their mark on the Final Fantasy franchise, with their individual DNA all over the first 3 installments in that order. But as Square attempted to grow and expand, all 3 were given license to explore creating their own properties. This allowed Takashi Tokita and Hiroyuki Ito the opportunity to put their stamp on Final Fantasy IV, and the same cycle occurred again, as after the completion of the project, Tokita followed the path laid out before him by Ishii, Kawazu, and Tanaka by leaving the Final Fantasy team. He first served as the scenario director on the next Hanjaku Hero game, working alongside Kazuhiko Aoki, before then being given the opportunity to create his own IP, which ended up being called Live Alive. Tokita's departure then worked in with Sakaguchi's second objective when building out the team, to give some of the brightest talent from across the company the chance to step up and show the world what they could do. One of the individuals who benefited the most from this was a young, aspiring employee called Yoshinori Kitase. Kitase had joined Square in early 1990 and was first assigned to assist Koichi Ishii with the creation of Seiken Densetsu, or Final Fantasy Adventure as it was known in North America. Soon after, he was assigned to Kawazu's team to help with Romancing Saga. But there was something about the way Kitase approached writing that made people stand up and take notice, and this led to him being promoted to fulfill part of the role that Tokita had previously filled. Kitase was not the only individual to benefit from this organizational initiative, however. Hiromi Ito, who had previously worked on producing graphics for Saga 2, Seiken Densetsu and Romancing Saga, was also given the chance to step up, as was a young Hiroshita Kai. The third objective of Sakaguchi was then the addition of new hires. Sakaguchi felt that this was one of the most important pieces, as even though he and other senior figures were still quite young themselves, there was also an appreciation that due to being so ingrained in the industry, they may become blind to what consumers actually wanted. New hires were therefore important to gain fresh perspectives of not just what the youth were interested in, but also how people from different backgrounds and with different skill sets set about attempting to solve the same challenges. One of the youngest members of the team, for example, was an aspiring artist called Tetsuya Nomura. Nomura had studied design at a vocational school for advertising, but decided to turn his back on the advertising industry as he felt there were too many restrictions on his creativity. He had applied to Square on a whim, and when joining, was amazed at how much freedom there was to not only explore his own creativity, but to influence how the games were developed. The final piece of the puzzle that Sakaguchi worked on was then solidifying the spine, and after not working on Final Fantasy IV, as they wanted her experience and talent to help make Romancing Saga a success, Kazuko Shibuya rejoined the Final Fantasy team, serving as the lead on creating object graphics, which included character sprites and menus, and working alongside the less experienced Hiromi Ito. It meant the final development team consisted of 25 people, and it was primarily made up of people who had worked on Final Fantasy IV and Romancing Saga. Only 4 individuals remained though who had worked on the original Final Fantasy. but they were in very senior roles: director, lead field programmer, lead battle programmer, and lead object graphics. Those who worked on Final Fantasy IV and stayed with the team were also retained in crucial positions, with every role related to game design and battle systems occupied by the same people. New members of the team then occupied positions relating to scenario, map design, and battle graphics. And this was very purposeful. They wanted some elements to be fresh, and they wanted some elements to be iterated upon. With the core team assembled, Final Fantasy V kicked off in earnest as a project in September 1991. The team started out by providing initial concept sketches and potential scenarios, and during this phase, ideas were accepted from anywhere, irrespective of seniority or specialism. Sakaguchi and the other senior leads were then there to help shape the wider direction of the project, either by proposing ideas themselves or by polishing rough concepts that were brought forth by the wider team. During this time, Sakaguchi also worked with people like Ken Narita, Kiyoshi Yoshi, and Katsuhisa Higuchi, three of the most senior programmers at Square, to determine the scope. Final Fantasy IV had been developed on an 8MB ROM cartridge. This was a significant increase on Final Fantasy III, which had been created on a ROM cartridge that had a capacity of 512 kilobytes. And there was an initial feeling that, because of how much more space they had to play with by comparison, that an 8MB ROM cartridge would suffice again. After all, in the earlier days of the franchise, they were used to working with far less, and the first 3 games were still able to feel distinctly unique despite these restrictions. Using a larger ROM cartridge also had the potential to increase the overheads of the project, as they were more costly to manufacture, and it also aligned with higher production costs relating to staff, as more assets may need to be created. So the initial plan was to keep things small and consistent. But with Final Fantasy IV continuing to sell well even after the summer period, the decision was taken to push the Super Famicom to its limits. So an 8MB cartridge was first pushed aside in favour of a 12MB cartridge, and then a 16MB cartridge. The other major decision around this time related to the literal direction they wanted the project to take. They knew Final Fantasy V was to be another role-playing game, as it was the DNA of the franchise, but they didn't quite know what type of role-playing game it was going to be. Final Fantasy IV had served as a huge step forward for the franchise, with its bold new focus on scenarios paying dividends. But it wasn't without its detractors. There were those who had entered the franchise through either Final Fantasy I, II, or III that felt it was far too linear by comparison with regards to how the story was portrayed. But this notion also extended to character progression and how the game forced players to use set combinations of characters to solve challenges put before them. Final Fantasy IV had also been given the objective of trying to introduce a new host of fans to the franchise from demographics that were outside of those the first 3 games had tried to cater towards. And if that objective had been accomplished, then those new fans were to have gained expectations about the future that may or may not have been contradictory to what the existing fans wanted. This therefore meant the next step in the evolution of the Final Fantasy franchise was incredibly crucial, as Sakaguchi did not want to further ostracize their core audience, nor did he want to alienate the new fans they had just attracted. Ultimately, Sakaguchi knew that when working on a series of this nature, there was always going to be pressure when it came to putting out a new installment. But he always saw this as a fun challenge to overcome, and he felt that this was what brought out the best of his team, serving as the most extreme form of motivation. How they solved the challenge was never set in stone, but there was just one stipulation. Whatever they went to market with had to build upon the previous work, keeping it interesting and engaging for the audiences they had already attracted by pushing beyond what they had previously accomplished. Balancing that freshness with inheriting the past work was a really tricky thing to do though, but they had done it 3 times before and felt they had a good approach this time around too. The decision was therefore taken to create a new game that neither served as a complete summation of everything Final Fantasy had been up until that point, nor a direct non-canonical successor to Final Fantasy IV that just iterated and improved. Instead, the team decided to create something that combined elements from Final Fantasy III and IV to create something of a best of both worlds product, so as to create a new type of Final Fantasy that blended numerous successful elements together while innovating in other areas. In the most basic of senses, this notion applied to almost every aspect of the game's structure and design, from the scenario to the party and how they were set up, character progression, visuals, music, and of course, the battle system. Perhaps the most important decision, however, which affected almost every other aspect of the game, was that the notion of a huge non-fixed party that was a prevalent feature of Final Fantasy IV was removed in favour of returning to a traditional party of 4. By the end of 1991, most of the detailed specifications had been narrowed down and finalised. A 150-page document had been produced that outlined the story and an initial version of the script. And from that point forward, the development team was then split into two defined groups. One that was going to handle the battle system and other general systems related to character development and progression, and one that handled almost everything else. When working on Final Fantasy IV, Hiroyuki Ito worked with Akihiko Matsui and Kazuhiko Yoki to produce a dynamic and engaging twist on the traditional turn-based combat system. They dubbed it the Active Time Battle System, and after numerous revisions throughout the development process, what they ended up going to market with stunned audiences, in a good way. Even though Aoki left the Final Fantasy team to then work with Togita on the new Hanjaku Hero, Ito and Matsui were retained, and so too were Yoshi and Higuchi, who had worked as programmers on the under-the-hood implementation of the battle systems associated with the two previous games. Working in line with the wider initiative associated with Final Fantasy V, they therefore approached the battle system design with the objective of building upon what they had already created, while at the same time introducing a whole host of new innovations to keep things fresh. In the most basic of senses, this meant the ATB system was to be retained, and the job system from Final Fantasy III was to return. But just because the same concepts were being brought back, it didn't mean they were to function in the same way. The ATB system, for example, was enhanced by the inclusion of the ATB bar. In Final Fantasy IV, even though the notion of active time was present and the ATB gauge was very much functioning, there was no visual indication as to how long the player had to wait for their character's turn to arrive. The ATB bar was designed to solve that challenge, but its introduction then allowed them to have a bit more fun with other aspects of design, and this then played into the revised job system. Final Fantasy III revolutionized the notion of jobs via a system that was designed by Hiromichi Tanaka and then supplemented by Sakaguchi. It proposed that characters could change jobs as the journey continued, with no characters being locked into whatever they chose at the beginning of the game. But as neither Ito or Matsui had worked on its creation, they approached the job system with a fresh pair of eyes. The initial array of jobs was quite traditional, as they were almost all associated with the original Final Fantasy. But there was a major exception, and this highlighted just how expansive the new job system was to be, as alongside the white and black mages, another coloured mage was introduced called the Blue Mage. During the initial planning stages, someone on the team thought, wouldn't it be cool to have the playable characters somehow be able to use enemy attacks in battle? That then became the premise for the Blue Mage, as they were granted a unique affinity with the many monsters that were encountered as part of the overriding quest to save the world from destruction. This allowed them to learn skills or magic from enemies and claim the technique as their own through the use of a passive ability called learning. For example, let's say that one of the characters was rocking the Blue Mage job when fighting against a Chimera. If that enemy used Aqua Breath and the player was hit by the attack, then they could learn it for use in later battles, like the Sandworm boss, which could be killed in one hit with that particular move. To ensure the job was just as useful as any other though, Blue Mage skills covered a broad spectrum of abilities, and this was down to its designation as a utility class. From an offensive perspective, not only did the Blue Mage gain access to powerful spells for rarer elements like Aqua Breath and Aero, but it also gave players access to classic attacks like 1,000 Needles and Goblin Punch. From the opposite side, Blue Mages were then able to use powerful defensive spells such as Mighty Guard, which provided Protect, Shell and Float, as well as White Wind, which healed the party by the same amount of HP that the caster currently had. The introduction of the ATB bar also placed emphasis on creating jobs that could showcase its capabilities, and this led to the creation of another mage class called the Time Mage. As development continued, over 20 unique jobs ended up being created. And what was impressive about this particular milestone was that unlike previous games where there was often a notion of upgrade jobs, such as the ninja in the original Final Fantasy, which was essentially an enhanced thief, or the devout in Final Fantasy III, which was just an enhanced white mage, in Final Fantasy V, every job had its own individual mechanics and function. Not all jobs made the cut, however. The diver, for example, was a job that was going to use a harpoon as a weapon, and was planned to enhance abilities for any characters using the job when fighting in or around water. An earlier iteration of the Beastmaster also ended up being absorbed into the Berserker job. But the array they ended up with was still very expansive, and due to the addition of a whole host of unique skills and passive abilities, the memory allocation was pushed to its absolute limit. Due to there being so many jobs, another core design principle proposed by Ito and Matsui related to ease of use. When they reflected on the job system from Final Fantasy III, there was a sense that it was too restrictive and confusing. They therefore wanted to make Final Fantasy V similar at its core, but much simpler and easy to use. To work towards that objective, the decision was taken to have character attributes remain the same, irrespective of the job being used. And on top of this, they made it so that job abilities were adjustable, and through the new mastery system could also be combined. This then made it possible for characters to work outside of the confines of the system to create hybrid jobs, and unlock the potential for players to craft hundreds of different command combinations. Working back around to the notion of the Blue Mage and how meticulously it was constructed, the same care and attention was then placed on every single job. The developers wanted to make sure that nobody ever felt penalised for the jobs they liked. They never wanted to make people feel like they had to change jobs in order to succeed. They also didn't want to penalise people who found a job they liked and never wanted to change away from it, even if that was one of the first jobs they got access to. Huge amounts of work was therefore done around balancing to make sure the game was possible to beat with every single conceivable party combination. They even tested the game to ensure it could be beaten without ever even changing jobs. And to further this principle, outside of there being no hidden or advanced jobs, the jobs that were made accessible to the player were made available quite early on in the game. None were locked away until the final stages. The idea behind this was that they knew players would want to start building their protagonists almost as soon as the game started, nurturing them as they played through the game and supplementing their skill sets. This then served as a loose allusion to Final Fantasy II, where characters developed based on utilization. But even though all of this was incredibly exciting, there were countless innovations beyond the job system and the ATB system. New status effects were introduced, such as aging and zombie, that were designed to challenge players in ways they just previously weren't. Best equipment and remove all commands were added to the menu system for ease of use when it came to equipping characters, and the item capacity was expanded to 255. A brand new shortcut mechanic was even added that was selectable from the options menu. This allowed characters to perform specific abilities or use specific spells quickly without having to navigate through the menu system to select them every single time. The multiplayer feature introduced in Final Fantasy IV was also carried over, but it was now given much more purpose due to the fixed nature of the party. This meant players could delegate control of specific characters throughout the entire game, adding to the immersion and turning Final Fantasy into a more shared experience. Each of these elements pushed the system design to heights that anyone who played Final Fantasy IV would never have thought possible. But this was a testament to the work of the team, and perhaps their crowning glory in this regard didn't relate to the party or jobs, but the enemies that the player encountered as they fought their way through the story. In the first 4 games, enemies were given abilities and simplistic attack patterns. Some bosses were made to feel more adaptive, but for the most part, everything was quite formulaic. And once the pattern of those more complicated bosses was established, it was just a case of adapting. To work in with everything else, Ito felt that Final Fantasy V needed to feel more advanced, and came up with a precursor to what later became known as the Gambit system. Using this system, enemies were given routines that were situation-based, as opposed to set in stone. This meant that instead of monsters just using a set move based on a specific pattern, or having it based on random number generation, the abilities were purposeful based on the scenario they were facing. This meant enemies were able to adapt depending on the actions of the party, and it created a system whereby, depending on the party setup, two players may end up being challenged by the same encounter in very different ways. And this would then encourage players to adapt themselves and come up with new strategies. Due to this system, and there being so many potential ability combinations thanks to the expansive job system, when playtesting was underway, the team were constantly finding new ways of beating bosses and regular encounters. During the initial design phase, they never set out to have this as an objective, but it just evolved that way out of a desire to make the game fun for everyone who played it. The biggest challenge, however, was that the team had to proactively try and stop Ito from making modifications to the system. Sakaguchi shared that they made a proactive decision to only inform Ito of bugs or unintended exploits as opposed to successful strategies, as they wanted players to experience the same joy and thrill of defeating bosses in unorthodox ways as they themselves had felt during the playtesting. Ito, however, still continued to try and tinker with bosses and enemy gambits to make the encounters as hard and challenging as possible without being unfair. With all of these elements considered, even though the scope was diminished in terms of characters, it was increased in so many other areas. But the aspect the team were most proud of was that they had also managed to make the system that much more accessible and complicated at the same time. This meant Final Fantasy V was able to appeal to casual fans and hardcore fans in equal measure, perhaps more so than any prior game. And beyond that, the system was just easy to have fun with. While Ito and Matsui toiled away on developing all of the battle and gameplay systems, the rest of the team attempted to make sure that all of the other elements were of the same high standard. And perhaps the most important aspect was the narrative. With so much praise given to the strength of Final Fantasy IV's scenario, Sakaguchi knew that they should continue down the same path while amplifying certain aspects and course-correcting others. The large party had been created as a way of trying to resolve the issues of the first 3 games. It exposed players to plenty of unique characters, each with their own backstories and motivations. And with so much happening in the world, having party members rotate added an element of agency. The downside was that the experience felt much more linear, with players given limited control over how the story developed and how they could tackle the gameplay challenges they were faced with. The resolution was therefore to shrink everything back down to a party of 4, but retain the protagonists being given specific names, backstories, and individual narrative arcs. The element of choice and non-linearity then came via the job system, but the team was also conscious about making the story less linear too, and more impactful. Despite coming from a non-gaming background, Kitase was obsessed with movies. He had studied storytelling techniques and was very particular about how scenes should be delivered. After being hired by Square, this keen attention to detail was evidenced via scenes he was given on Seiken Densetsu, and Sakaguchi and other senior members took note. Final Fantasy V represented a real opportunity for Kitase to step up, and he worked alongside Sakaguchi and a new hire called Ikuya Dobishi to build out the scenario and introduce elements of comedy to balance out the quite serious themes. For his part, Sakaguchi had always been more attached to the scenario than any other aspect of development. He had played a prominent part in either conceiving or doctoring many of the previous plots, but had then often delegated the actual script writing to someone else. For Final Fantasy III, that someone else was Kenji Terada, with Tokita then taking up the mantle on Final Fantasy IV. This time around, however, there was a notion that, due to how much the scenario had to be evolved, it was too much work for one person to take on. So, even though he was still serving as the overall director, Sakaguchi and Kitase penned the script together, with Kitase then producing many of the in-game scenes that happened in the field that were referred to as events. Dobeshi then complemented the work done by Sakaguchi and Kitase, as he was responsible for the more subtle storytelling that related to the world map and dungeons. Other staff members were still able to put forth their own ideas for event sequences, however. Hiroyuki Ito, for example, even proposed a fun narrative development that related to forcing the player to choose between picking a chicken knife or a brave blade, as this then tied directly in with the battle system. The characters themselves were also designed to be contrasting and surprising. This meant that while Bart and Lena were quintessential characters who represented the polarizing exuberance of youth and responsibility, Galuf was there as a mysterious older hand, and Faris was something of an enigma. Her identity was made purposefully ambiguous from the start of the game, as after being inspired by the manga Princess Knight, Sakaguchi decided to create a homage, with Faris disguising herself and acting as a man despite being Lena's long-lost sister. Faris' reveal was not the only reveal Sakaguchi and Kitase plotted, however. Both Final Fantasy II and IV had introduced the notion of sacrifice amongst the playable cast, as with the characters all being named and there being so many of them, they felt it could add some emotional brevity. But with Final Fantasy V only featuring 4 playable party members, introducing the same idea was a lot more complicated. The solution was therefore to introduce a 5th party member who served as a near-direct replacement for the character who was no longer to be supporting the party. And this then meant they could have all the emotional weight without there being any kind of gameplay penalization. By the end of the process, despite the reduced cast, Final Fantasy V ended up with over 4 times as many event sequences compared to Final Fantasy IV. Sakaguchi, Kitase, and Dabeshi had outdone themselves, making use of all the available storage, but some harsh decisions still needed to be made along the way. Similar to Final Fantasy IV, where the story ended up being far too dense, a culling process, of course, had to happen. It was nowhere near as severe, but ancillary scenes and dialogue that didn't move the plot forward or add any pertinent backstory were removed. That being said, one of the major things they wanted to keep was optional sequences. To address the criticism around linearity, Sakaguchi was keen to introduce numerous event scenes that were not mandatory. They were designed to reward players for exploring and undertaking short side quests, but they were not crucial to understanding the story or the wider lore. The quest designed by Ito around selecting the blade was the perfect example, but it was via this particular initiative that the famed mimic Gogo was introduced alongside the innovative strategy for defeating it, while another was more narrative focused and revolved around Faris finding her old friend Sildra. These aspects highlighted how much the development of Final Fantasy V became a team effort, with people pitching in from all across the team. But perhaps the area that felt this the most was aspects relating to presentation. Final Fantasy IV was very much seen as a transitional game by the development team. Although new assets were created, much of the focus was placed around utilising the new options available, such as expanded colour palettes and the Mode 7 capabilities. It was for this reason that some of the same sprites that were introduced within the Famicom era were brought back, such as Paladin Cecil essentially being a recoloured version of the Knight from Final Fantasy III. Many of the NPCs, such as black mages and soldiers, were also just palette swaps and were given near identical animations. Final Fantasy V was meant to represent how much the creative team had evolved, and no expense was spared. Part of the reason that Kazuko Shibuya was brought back onto the team was due to her incredible talent with pixel art, and her ability to create assets with incredible efficiency, while also being of a high standard. In the past, she had focused on all aspects of pixel design, from creating party members, monster sprites, and even the UI. But due to the sheer scale of Final Fantasy V, she was classified as creating object graphics, and Hiromi Ito was assigned to assist her. Part of the challenge was that even though the party was much smaller in size, due to the volume of jobs available and the necessity for each job to have a unique sprite for every character, over 100 unique sprites had to be created for the final version. And with each character also having unique movement patterns and actions, thousands of party-specific assets had to be made. To put this into perspective, even though Final Fantasy III introduced the job change system, only 282 sprites needed to be created for the entire party. Due to the ballooning party size, this number then jumped to over 900 for Final Fantasy IV, but Final Fantasy V ended up featuring over 3,000 party-specific sprites, which was more than 10 times the amount required for Final Fantasy III. It was a colossal undertaking, and it pushed Shibuya and Ito to the limit of what they could do, both artistically, but also in terms of what they could actually deliver within the specified time frame. To assist with other aspects of asset creation, 2 other teams were therefore formulated, one to focus on field graphics, which contained Tetsuya Takahashi and Hideo Manaba, and another to focus on battle graphics, which contained the most junior artists, including the likes of Tetsuya Nomura and Hiroshi Takai. Both of these areas were given real focus, with the world map, dungeons and towns now given much more purposeful and ornate designs. And as if to showcase how much this particular aspect of the visuals was being amped up, the opening sequence had a lavish castle that featured tons of intricacies. The battle scene was also enhanced to feature dynamic elements, and even though Yoshitaka Amano returned to create concepts for all the major monsters featured in the game, the team of 5 artists who were responsible for translating his work to pixel format were also given license to come up with their own ghoulish and ghastly creations. Alongside the visual presentation elements, audio was also given the same enhanced treatment. By this point, Noboru Uematsu had been solidified as one of the preeminent talents in Japan when it came to video game compositions, with Square able to put on sell-out concerts dedicated to his work, and original sound versions selling tens of thousands of copies upon release. But there was still room to grow, and to help Uematsu with this endeavour, a sub-team was set up with the specific focus of working alongside Uematsu and supporting him and ensuring that what he envisioned was possible in-game. Minoru Akeo, for example, was a sound programmer who spent a lot of time figuring out a way to have the map music continue playing where it left off after a battle had concluded, as there was a sense that having it start again from the beginning each time broke the immersion. With this now being Uematsu's 5th Final Fantasy soundtrack though, he was keen to try new things. As such, he composed the opening theme first and the ending theme last. Uematsu also tried to work on tracks in tandem with the development teams, often trying to get ahead of where they were in-game. This meant he'd write music based on what he thought the scenes may look like, and sometimes this meant he'd have to redo pieces based on how they turned out in-game, but others, there would be a moment of elation when the developers heard how the music sounded due to Uematsu's unique interpretation of the sequence. It meant that, unlike other composers, who were often siloed away from the team, Uematsu was very much included as part of a dynamic and inclusive environment. Collaboration was encouraged, and everyone was made to feel like they could contribute no matter their role. Ultimately, even though Uematsu tried to keep things interesting by introducing elements such as Nordic themes and finding ways to reintroduce classic themes that fans had come to know and love, he also struggled throughout the project, and this took a toll on his mental health. Similar to other departments, he was required to write more music than he'd ever written before, but in the same amount of time. And after reading through the script, Uematsu had initially thought the game might require around 100 pieces of unique music. After careful consideration, he was at least able to cut this down to 56. Even still, despite cutting down the expected scope by a considerable number, which meant Final Fantasy V only contained 14 more tracks than the previous game, the tracks were now much longer and more structured. This meant Final Fantasy V featured more than double the combined track length of Final Fantasy IV. Such concessions were vital for helping to control the workload, but many of the departments struggled with scope creep. Due to the size of the ROM cartridge being increased so much, every single team wanted to show what they could do, and so demanded more and more resources. Hiroshi Takai, for example, was told he had twice as much capacity for creating the visual effects related to spells than there was available on Final Fantasy IV. He therefore sought to make the animations even more complex, but miscalculated and ended up using 3 times more storage. But due to his work then being approved, Takai had to keep going around to his colleagues in other departments asking if he could make use of any spare capacity they might have available. It was for this reason that many other aspects had to be cut. In this regard, monsters were one of the easiest things to be scrapped, and this meant that even though there was an increase in the volume of normal enemies and bosses available for players to test themselves against, this increase was marginal at around only 25%. Other aspects that were deemed superfluous were also removed, such as re-implementing the developer's room from Final Fantasy IV. There just wasn't enough space. Any space they had to just be focused on delivering the core experience to the highest quality, as opposed to ancillary elements that could enhance the experience in more fringe ways. Beyond this, the team also had to contend with numerous setbacks that meant deadlines became even more tight. At one point, for example, the office caught on fire, and due to the hardware they were using and how much it was being pushed, there were often crashes. And should developers be in the unfortunate situation of not having saved their data on a regular cadence, this could lead to hours upon hours of unsaved work needing to be recreated. Despite all of these challenges, however, development wrapped up in July of 1992, with full-on development of Final Fantasy V only taking around 7 months. It was in and around this time that the two distinct development groups then merged together to work harmoniously on the final stretches, namely the crucial debugging phase. With the game being so dense, and with there being so many hidden details and potential job combinations across all the characters, debugging was of paramount importance. Bugs were always going to creep into the final product, that was a given for any kind of role-playing experience, but the developers had to make sure that there were no game-breaking bugs found that related to what could be considered the core path, and any paths that were closely related to that core path. Their objective throughout these 2 months was therefore to try and play through the game in every conceivable way. This was a monotonous and laborious experience, especially considering many of the team had already spent 7 months slaving away creating the various aspects. But the game was given the green light in October, going gold before its planned launch in December. Final Fantasy IV had gone through a rather tumultuous pre-launch marketing cycle due to cancellations and the wider focus on trying to appeal to a new audience. But with the Super Famicom now more established, and with Final Fantasy very much positioned as one of the premium brands, things were a lot more straightforward ahead of the release of Final Fantasy V. Or at least, that's how it seemed. Whereas Enix had hit the Famicom hard, releasing 4 Dragon Quest games in quick succession, when it came to the Super Famicom, they wanted to take their time and release a product that was befitting of the name and prestige of the brand. This approach meant Final Fantasy IV launched without serious competition. But this time around, both Dragon Quest V and Final Fantasy V were planned to go head-to-head. And as Square had already shown their hand, there were serious question marks around how the market-leading Japanese-developed role-playing franchise, Dragon Quest, was going to look in the 16-bit era, and whether it would further cement its position as the top dog. Despite loose mentions and allusions that they were working on a follow-up to Final Fantasy IV, it actually took some time before Square were ready to lift the lid and reveal the next iteration on the franchise. The long-awaited reveal happened on the 7th of August 1992 in issue 190 of Famitsu magazine. And what was curious about this particular reveal date was that development on the game was already completed before the game was announced. It was never confirmed, but it felt like they were attempting to compensate for what had happened with the whole debacle surrounding the cancelled Famicom version of Final Fantasy IV and the subsequent rebranding of Final Fantasy V to Final Fantasy IV. They just wanted to mitigate all risk and ensure there was a limited period between the time of announcement and launch so as to maximize and then capitalize on hype. Not too long after, on the 27th of August, Final Fantasy V then appeared at Famicom Space World 1992, where it went head-to-head with Dragon Quest V. From this point onwards, the two games were in direct competition with each other, but even though Square were seemingly at a disadvantage, with Dragon Quest the most established franchise, Dragon Quest V the most anticipated game, and Enix having already started the marketing cycle in earnest for that game. Throughout September, it became apparent that Final Fantasy was the game winning the hype war, not Dragon Quest. After Famicom Space World, attendees were surveyed, and one of the questions on the survey related to their most anticipated game based on what they had played. Final Fantasy V ended up receiving 955 votes, which placed it firmly in the number 1 spot. But perhaps most importantly, this was 80% more votes than Dragon Quest V. This survey then began to be reflected within Famitsu's infamous Most Wanted poll. Within the same issue, Final Fantasy V had supplanted Dragon Quest V to take the top spot, and to further emphasize how impressive this was, the top 5 games were all role-playing titles, with Landstalker, Shin Megami Tensei, and Mother 2, the other highly anticipated upcoming games in that genre. The margin between Final Fantasy V and Dragon Quest V only continued to widen from this point, despite Dragon Quest V launching in just 3 months. And this was a scenario that was beyond the wildest dreams of anyone at Square. Keen to continue the momentum, they revealed tons of information via Famitsu, including a huge deep dive into the countless jobs that were to be featured. Issue 200 of Famitsu included some of the heavy hitters, with subsequent issues running through the additional jobs. This approach was quite different from the approach taken with the previous game, as it was very much geared around pleasing existing fans and getting them excited, as opposed to trying to capture new audiences. And this ended up being a very purposeful marketing approach. Despite their huge objective of expanding their demographics, it wasn't until Final Fantasy V was well into production that they found out that Final Fantasy IV hadn't actually attracted as many new fans as they thought. Surveys showed that their core demographics were still middle school and high school students. They had failed to attract elementary school students and adults in any kind of significant way. The only thing that had happened was that their existing audience from the Famicom era had just grown up and been replaced by younger gamers in the exact same demographic. Based on this knowledge, the marketing team decided to place less effort on attempting to appeal to as many people as possible and instead focused more on their core audience. But even though that was the case, it didn't mean they had to dial things back, and they went big on creating an innovative range of high-quality TV commercials. For years, Square had been producing TV commercials for their games, choosing purposeful time slots and airing in specific regions of Japan where they knew they were going to get the biggest bang for their buck. But they also had taken unorthodox approaches, as shown by the commercials they produced for Final Fantasy IV. For Final Fantasy V, by late September, over 100 different marketing proposals had been submitted for what the latest round of big-budget TV commercials should look like. These were then narrowed down to just 4, and then just 1, which proposed using cutting-edge computer graphics. This proposal became known as the Chocobo Hole, as the premise focused around the Chocobo observing some iconic foes from previous games that appeared from a hole. Armed with a budget of around $300,000, a couple of different variants were produced, with each one only lasting around 10 to 15 seconds. And those variants were then shown across 7 major cities, ensuring they air between 6 PM and 9 PM in the lead up to launch and the month after to ensure their primary demographic was hit. Alongside this, Square also revealed the Final Fantasy V 5+1 mini-album as a way of getting people even more excited. It featured 5 tracks from the upcoming game composed by Uematsu, but it also featured a special arrangement of Matoya's Cave from the original game, which had been reworked using the increased hardware capabilities of the Super Famicom sound chip. But with so much anticipation building ahead of launch, the elephant in the room was still Dragon Quest V. Launching on the 27th of September, everyone was keen to see how the first Dragon Quest game in years was going to perform. But with reportedly hundreds of thousands of pre-orders and many more thousands queuing outside of game stores on the day of release, it was no surprise to hear that it sold almost 600,000 copies by the end of its first day on sale, and just shy of another 600,000 were then sold in the following week. With publications and word of mouth in supporting the hype and confirming that the game had delivered on expectation, the further was justified and the sales continued. But by December, there was a craving for more, and Final Fantasy V arrived at just the right time to take advantage. When the game launched on the 6th of December, it wasn't quite able to match Dragon Quest V, but almost 300,000 copies were sold on launch day. Compared to previous Final Fantasies, this was a monumental figure, and it was almost 3 times more than Final Fantasy IV had accomplished in its first 3 days on sale. And whereas Final Fantasy IV grew to sell 250,000 copies in its second week, Final Fantasy V grew to sell almost 500,000. This momentum then carried on, and by the end of 1992, despite only being on sale for a few weeks, Final Fantasy V had managed to sell more than its predecessor in its entirety, and became the first game in the franchise, and for Square as a company, to sell over 2 million copies. But despite the huge commercial success, which was amplified by Final Fantasy V retailing at a higher price point than its predecessor, critics were not quite as easily pleased. In Famitsu, Final Fantasy V scored 34 out of 40, which was worse than the previous game, and their comments were varied. Minoru Noda and Rolling Uchizawa both scored the game as an 8, as they felt the new job system was a marvel due to how complex it was, despite being so accessible, with the protagonist and storyline making everything feel like an interactive movie. Isabella Nagano, who awarded the game a 9, also felt that Final Fantasy V had a compelling story, and that they maximized the hardware. However, despite also giving the game a 9, Adotsu Suzuki summed up the wider sentiment. They stated that even though the game was made much more accessible, It was too similar to Final Fantasy IV and lacked freshness. Fans, however, did not agree. After collating votes submitted by readers of Family Computer magazine, Final Fantasy V was awarded a 27.91, which was 0.34 higher than its predecessor. They felt the game was more original, had better characters, was easier to play, and felt more engaging. However, they did feel as though the music had taken a step back in quality and that there was less replay value. It was perhaps because of this high praise and wider performance that Square then started to explore how the game could be localized and released for Western audiences. But this was where they faced a dilemma of their own making. After the disappointing Western launch of Final Fantasy IV, the general consensus at Square was that it had failed to appeal to North Americans because everything was just too complicated for them to understand. Despite there being a prospering market for role-playing games amongst PC enthusiasts, they felt the same awareness of the genre didn't exist among those playing on home consoles, despite sales of the original Final Fantasy and the Final Fantasy branded spin-offs releasing on handheld consoles suggesting something to the contrary. To try and lay more solid foundations ahead of subsequent releases, Square therefore decided to greenlight Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. It was to be tailored specifically to the North American market and made much simpler. But this decision, when combined with all previous decisions, then created something of a quandary. The reality was that Final Fantasy was now suffering from a severe identity crisis in North America. They had so many different formats of games featuring the Final Fantasy name that it was difficult for consumers to figure out what they were getting into if they purchased a game that featured the branding. The original game must have felt like something of a distant cousin to Final Fantasy IV, and it was much the same for Final Fantasy Adventure and Final Fantasy Legend, which were so different they had grown to become independent franchises in Japan. Mystic Quest then muddied the waters even more, as it was similar to Final Fantasy Legend but featured different sub-branding, was on a different console, and was targeted by marketing at a different audience. Despite this, initial plans were drafted for a straight localization of Final Fantasy V, and it was planned to be called Final Fantasy III, so as to keep continuity with the previous release. Even though Square had turned around the North American localization of Final Fantasy IV in just a few months, with Mystic Quest launching around the same time in North America as Final Fantasy V did in Japan, this time though, there was a feeling that it might be best to wait and see how both were received before making any kind of solid commitment. The poor performance of Mystic Quest then dampened enthusiasm and compounded what Final Fantasy V represented to that market. Even though it was, in many ways, more accessible and easier to play, there was also a sense that Final Fantasy V was way more complicated than the previous game and Mystic Quest, especially as neither Final Fantasy II or III had ever been localized. So there was no kind of familiarity with any kind of job change system or character evolution in that region. As such, they wanted to take their time and make the appropriate tweaks, and the initial plan was to launch Final Fantasy V as Final Fantasy III towards the end of 1993. Those plans, however, were shelved, as things became even more muddied when Final Fantasy VI came onto the scene. Within Square, there became an appreciation that Final Fantasy II, III, and V were more controller command-driven games, whereas Final Fantasy II, IV, and the soon-to-be-released VI were more story-driven games. Even though Final Fantasy I had been a considerable success, they felt that North Americans had changed to wanting more story-driven experiences, and this was supposedly supported by testing they had done amongst focus groups. As Final Fantasy V didn't align with this, it left them in limbo as to what to do. Their first thought was that due to how different V was from the previous entry released under the Final Fantasy banner in North America, that it may perform better if it launched as a completely different franchise, and for a time that was the plan, as was reported by EGM based on their sources. Then, due to perceived difficulty and the also perceived inability for North Americans to understand role-playing concepts, they considered launching it as Final Fantasy Extreme, as was revealed by Ted Woolsey when speaking to a UK-based publication called Superplay. In the same interview, Woolsey also revealed that because of the change in naming convention, they were also planning to release Final Fantasy V out of sequence, bringing it to market in 1995 after the planned localized launch of Final Fantasy VI, which was then to be rebranded as Final Fantasy III instead of V. Their hope was that Final Fantasy VI would post better results than Final Fantasy IV or Mystic Quest, and that this increased interest may then make it easier to sell this different kind of Final Fantasy game. But upon launch, Final Fantasy VI didn't perform well in North America either, and the localization of the Super Nintendo version of Final Fantasy V was outright cancelled as a result. That wasn't the end of their attempts though. Final Fantasy VII, unlike Final Fantasy VI, did resonate with the North American market, and this happened on the PlayStation, but also on the PC. This then led to Square hiring a company called Top Dog to oversee a port of the Super Famicom version for PC. However, it became very difficult for Top Dog to complete the task. They had two options: either emulate the home console into a PC application and hope they could dump the contents of the cartridge with no issues, or try to reproduce the game from scratch. They chose the latter as it promised better results, and they had experience with this approach. But once they committed, they found that most of the documentation that explained what all the code did was in Japanese, and none of the developers spoke that language. To try and overcome the problem, someone from Square's Japanese office flew over to Top Dog to try and act as an intermediary. But despite working for 2 months with the team to try and help them overcome these challenges, things only ended up becoming worse. Neither company had worked with this kind of arrangement before, and too many assumptions had been made. So instead of trying to brute force their way through the project, the decision was made to cancel the agreement between Square and Top Dog. Around the same time though, Square had managed to forge a successful working relationship with Eidos. Eidos had managed to somehow reverse engineer a PC port of Final Fantasy VII, and they took over the project. Eidos though encountered the same struggles as Top Dog, and the PC version of Final Fantasy V never saw the light of day. But work done by both companies did serve as the basis for the localized PlayStation version that then launched in North America in 1999 before being released in Europe in 2002. Even though Final Fantasy V struggled to see an overseas release for many years, that did not diminish its impact around the world. It just may not have been apparent to fans at the time. Not long after its release in Japan, for example, the Final Fantasy V soundtrack was released and went on to sell over 135,000 copies, by far the best performance of any kind of music-related merchandise Square had ever released. The strategy guide was also so successful that it ended up as the 6th best-selling book in Japan in 1993. And as if to show how much the gap between the franchises had narrowed, the Dragon Quest V strategy guide appeared in the position above. But that wasn't the end of Square's aspirations to market this product, and they introduced a plethora of new merchandising initiatives as a way of trying to satisfy their very expectant audiences. Perhaps one of the more novel creations was an extensive line of collectible cards. Due to the sheer volume of assets created throughout production, the marketing team thought it would be very prudent to try and maximize the return on investment of those assets. After all, Shibuya and Ito had created hundreds of individual in-game sprites. There was a sense that, due to how many possible combinations there were, players may gain certain affinities with